Hey there, welcome to Broderos. Tonight, we've got hours of chilling horror stories combined with soothing rain sounds to help you relax and sleep. Before you drift off, leave a comment below and let us know where you're listening from and what time it is. And don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe right away. If you end up not enjoying it, you can always take it back later. Get cozy and let the fear take over. Have you ever seen something you can't explain? Something that makes your skin crawl even though you're safe behind locked doors? It was late, too late for anyone to be working in the office. But here I was, staring at the monitor of the security system, fighting off fatigue with a cup of lukewarm coffee. The night shift wasn't my choice, but I needed the extra hours to pay the bills. The office was as ordinary as they came, rows of cubicles, buzzing fluorescent lights, and a vending machine that only worked half the time. On the screen, the grainy footage revealed empty hallways and desks bathed in a dull gray glow. I yawned and leaned back, letting my eyes wander between the four quadrants of the monitor. At first, everything seemed normal. Then, in the top left feed, something shifted, a flicker in the corner of the frame. I squinted, leaning closer. It looked like a shadow, but there was nothing in the office to cast it. The shadow moved. At first, it was subtle, almost imperceptible. But as I focused, it became clearer. It slithered along the wall, defying the angles of the furniture and the light sources. It passed through a desk as if it weren't there, its shape distorting as it crossed into the open corridor. Must be a glitch, I muttered, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. I tapped the monitor, hoping the interference would clear. It didn't. I checked the other feeds. The rest of the office was still and silent, but in that one quadrant, the shadow continued its eerie journey, sliding along walls and floors with an unnatural fluidity. My fingers hovered over the keyboard. Should I rewind the footage? Call someone? But who would I call at this hour? And what would I even say? Then it happened. The shadow stopped. It was in the hallway now, just outside the conference room. For a moment, it stayed perfectly still, like it was waiting for something or someone. And then, slowly, it turned. Turned? No, that couldn't be right. Shadows didn't turn. But this one did. It stretched across the floor, elongating as if reaching out. And that's when I saw it, a faint outline, almost like a figure. 2 arms, 2 legs, and a head. A chill ran down my spine. I told myself it was just my imagination, but my instinct screamed otherwise. Something was wrong, terribly wrong. The shadow moved again, this time directly toward the camera. The closer it got, the more defined it became, its edges sharpening as if it were stepping out of the two-dimensional space it inhabited. My breath caught as the screen began to glitch. The feed flickered and distorted, static lines racing across the display. I hit the keyboard, desperate to regain control, but the system wasn't responding. And then, just before the feed went black, I saw it. The shadow didn't just move toward the camera, it looked directly into it. The screen stayed black, reflecting only my pale, wide-eyed face. My hands trembled as I reached for the mouse, clicking aimlessly to bring the feed back. Nothing. The office around me suddenly felt colder. The hum of the fluorescent lights, usually a dull background noise, seemed louder, oppressive. I glanced over my shoulder, half expecting to see something or someone standing behind me. But the room was as empty as ever. Get it together, I whispered to myself. I rebooted the system, tapping the keys with shaky fingers. The monitor blinked back to life, showing static for a moment before the feeds returned. The hallway was empty again. No shadow, no figure, nothing. I let out a nervous laugh, the sound too sharp in the stillness. Just a glitch, I said aloud, trying to convince myself. But the unease lingered. I couldn't shake the image of that shadow, the way it had moved. It wasn't natural. And the way it had turned, as though it was aware of me. I stood, needing to move, needing to prove to myself that everything was fine. The office was normal, boring, even. I walked the length of the cubicles, the squeak of my sneakers on the polished floor the only sound. The hallway where I'd seen the shadow looked the same as ever. Gray walls, beige carpet, and the faint scent of stale coffee lingering in the air. I glanced at the conference room door. It was closed, just like it always was after hours. Still, I felt drawn to it, like a thread was pulling me closer. I stopped in front of the door, staring at the frosted glass pane in the center. It reflected the dim light from the hallway, but nothing else. No shadow, no movement. My hand hovered over the doorknob. Don't open it. The thought came unbidden, sharp and urgent. I hesitated, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I heard it. A faint sound, so quiet I almost missed it. A whisper? No, more like a rustle, like fabric brushing against a wall. It came from the other side of the door. I backed away, my pulse racing. Hello? My voice sounded weak, barely more than a whisper. No answer. I stood there, frozen, until the sound came again. Louder this time. Closer. I turned and walked quickly back to my desk, trying not to break into a full sprint. The monitor was still running, showing the same empty hallways and cubicles. But I didn't feel alone. I sat down and stared at the screen, my eyes darting between the feeds. I wanted to leave, but something kept me rooted in place. Call it curiosity or fear, but I had to know what was happening. And then, in the bottom right feed, something moved. Not a shadow this time. A chair in one of the cubicles shifted slightly, its wheels creaking against the floor. I leaned closer, my breath fogging the screen. The chair moved again, this time rolling back several feet, as if someone had pushed it. No one was there. I grabbed my phone and dialed the building supervisor, my fingers fumbling over the screen. It rang twice before going to voicemail. Of course. It was almost 3 in the morning. The chair in the feed stopped moving, but my eyes caught something else. In the reflection of a nearby computer screen, a faint shape flickered. A figure. I stared at the screen, my pulse hammering in my ears. The figure didn't move, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The lights in the office flickered, plunging the room into darkness for a split second before they stabilized. When I looked back at the monitor, the figure was gone. I sat frozen, my breath shallow, staring at the monitor as if the answers to all my questions might appear there. The figure was gone, but its absence felt worse. Every instinct screamed at me to leave, to get out of the building, but my body refused to cooperate. It was as though the air around me had thickened, trapping me in place. The sound of creaking echoed faintly from somewhere deeper in the office. It wasn't the usual groans of an old building settling, it was rhythmic, deliberate, like slow, heavy footsteps. I swallowed hard and forced myself to stand. My knees felt weak, but I managed to move toward the exit. Each step was cautious, deliberate, as if the floor itself might give way beneath me. The creaking grew louder. I turned a corner into the main hallway, my hand instinctively reaching for the wall to steady myself. The conference room door loomed ahead, its frosted glass pane now darker than before. The sound stopped. The silence was worse. I held my breath, straining to hear anything, any movement, any sign that I wasn't alone. Then I noticed it. The light from the vending machine at the far end of the hallway flickered, casting long, jagged shadows across the walls. And one of those shadows didn't match. It wasn't tied to any object in the room. It stood out, darker and sharper than the rest, its edges almost vibrating. It moved, shifting along the wall like liquid darkness, flowing closer with an unnatural grace. I stumbled back, my heart slamming against my ribs. The shadow stopped, stretching toward me as if testing the air. "Who's there?" My voice cracked, barely audible. The shadow didn't answer, but it didn't need to. The room grew colder, the air pressing down on me like a heavy weight. Suddenly, the overhead lights went out, plunging the office into darkness. My phone's faint glow was the only light left, its screen trembling in my shaking hand. I fumbled to turn on the flashlight, the beam slicing through the gloom. The hallway was empty. Or so I thought. Something moved at the edge of the light, a flicker of motion too quick to catch. I swung the beam toward it, but it was gone. Then, from behind me, came a sound that made my stomach drop. A whisper. Not a single voice, but many, overlapping in a chilling symphony of murmurs. The words were indistinct, their tone urgent, pleading. I spun around, the flashlight trembling in my grip. The beam landed on the conference room door, now slightly ajar. "No," I muttered under my breath, stepping back. But the whispers grew louder, pouring out of the room like a flood. The door creaked open wider, revealing only darkness beyond. My flashlight barely penetrated it, the light swallowed whole by the inky blackness. Then I saw them. Eyes. Dozens of them, glowing faintly in the dark, their gaze fixed on me. I stumbled back, my feet tangling beneath me as I hit the floor. My phone clattered away, the flashlight spinning wildly. Shadows erupted from the conference room, pouring into the hallway like living smoke. I scrambled to my feet, running blindly toward the exit. My breath came in ragged gasps, my pulse pounding in my ears. Behind me, the shadows followed, their movement unnatural, jerking, yet impossibly fast. I reached the stairwell door, slamming into it with all my weight. It burst open, and I practically fell onto the first step. The shadows didn't stop, flooding into the stairwell like a tidal wave of darkness. The whispers grew deafening now, a cacophony of anger, sorrow, and fear. I ran down the stairs, my legs burning, the shadows chasing me every step of the way. When I reached the ground floor, I burst through the exit into the cold night air. The city lights were a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness I had left behind. I turned back, expecting the shadows to pour out after me. But the doorway was empty. The building stood silent and still, its windows reflecting nothing but the empty street. For a moment, I thought it was over. Then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it. My shadow. But it wasn't moving with me anymore. I stumbled into the street, panting, clutching my chest as I tried to process what I had just seen. The cold air stung my lungs, but the relief of being outside was fleeting. My shadow stood still. It was there, stretched out under the faint glow of the streetlights, but it wasn't moving. I turned my head, raising my trembling hand, but my shadow didn't follow. It remained frozen, as though it were carved into the pavement. And then it moved. Not like a shadow should, but independently, shifting, twisting, its shape warping into something unnatural. I backed away, nearly tripping over the curb, but the shadow followed. It slid across the ground, stretching toward me, claw-like tendrils forming at its edges. "Stay away!" I shouted, my voice cracking. The shadow paused, shrinking slightly, but it didn't retreat. Instead, it began to rise. My stomach churned as I watched the shadow peel itself from the ground, becoming a three-dimensional figure. It was vaguely humanoid, but its features were indistinct, its edges rippling like smoke caught in a breeze. I turned and ran. The streets were empty at this hour, the buildings dark and lifeless. My shoes pounded against the pavement as I sprinted, my heart racing faster with every step. I glanced over my shoulder. It was following me. The shadow moved unnaturally, gliding across the ground, its form flickering like a broken projection. No matter how fast I ran, it kept pace, closing the distance between us. Ahead, I saw the glow of a convenience store, its lights a beacon of hope in the darkness. I bolted toward it, nearly slamming into the glass door as I burst inside. The clerk looked up, startled. "Hey, are you?" "Call the police," I shouted, cutting him off. I slammed the door shut, locking it and pressing my back against the glass. The clerk stared at me, confused. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. My eyes were fixed on the street outside. The shadow had stopped just beyond the store's lights, hovering at the edge of the illuminated sidewalk. It didn't cross the threshold. I let out a shaky breath, my body trembling with adrenaline. For a moment, I thought I was safe. But then the lights flickered. The fluorescent bulbs above buzzed and dimmed, casting long, jagged shadows across the store. The shadow outside began to shift, growing larger, its form pressing against the glass like it was testing the barrier. The clerk stepped closer, his face pale. "What is that?" Before I could answer, the lights went out completely. Darkness engulfed the store, the only sound my ragged breathing and the faint hum of the refrigeration units. I fumbled for my phone, turning on the flashlight. The beam cut through the darkness, but it felt weak, swallowed by the oppressive blackness that seemed to seep into the room. The shadow was inside. It moved silently, sliding along the walls, its form splitting and reforming as it closed in. The clerk screamed, backing away, but the sound was cut off abruptly. I swung the flashlight toward him, but he was gone. The shadow loomed before me, larger now, more defined. Its surface shimmered, almost like liquid, and within it, I saw shapes. Faces. Dozens of them, their mouths open in silent screams. I staggered back, my hand brushing against the counter. My fingers found something, a box cutter. I grabbed it, clutching it tightly as if it could protect me. The shadow surged forward, and I slashed wildly, the blade cutting through the air. For a moment, the shadow recoiled, its form rippling as though it felt the resistance. "Stay back," I shouted, swiping at it again. But it didn't stop. It enveloped the light from my phone, plunging me into complete darkness. The air grew cold, heavy, pressing against my chest. The whispers returned, louder now, filling my head with a cacophony of voices. And then, just as suddenly as it began, it stopped. The lights flickered back on, and the store was empty. The clerk was gone. The shadow was gone. I stood there, gasping for air, clutching the box cutter in my hand. My reflection stared back at me from the glass door, pale and shaken. But something was wrong. The reflection didn't match. My reflection wasn't holding a box cutter. I froze, staring at the glass door. My reflection stood motionless, its hand empty, lips slightly parted as though it wanted to speak. I raised the box cutter instinctively, and my reflection did nothing. What is this?" I whispered, my voice trembling. The reflection's eyes shifted, just barely, but enough for me to see. It wasn't looking at me, it was looking past me. I spun around, expecting to see the shadow or something worse. But the store was empty. The aisles were eerily quiet, the faint hum of the refrigerators the only sound. When I turned back to the glass, my reflection was gone. My stomach dropped. I stumbled backward, my breath coming in sharp gasps. Where my reflection should have been, there was only the empty store behind me. Then, a voice. It wasn't a whisper this time, it was clear, cold, and unmistakably mine. "You shouldn't have looked." I whipped around again, but no one was there. The lights flickered once more, and when they stabilized, the layout of the store had changed. Shelves were rearranged, aisles no longer led where they should, and the exit door was gone. Panic gripped me. I sprinted toward where the entrance had been, slamming into the glass, but it wasn't a door anymore, just a smooth, unbroken pane. "Let me out!" I shouted, pounding on the glass. Behind me, the shadows began to gather again, pooling in the corners of the store. They were darker now, thicker, and they moved with purpose. I turned to face them, clutching the box cutter like it was my only lifeline. "Stay back." The shadows ignored my command, their edges writhing as they advanced. Faces emerged from within them, twisted, anguished, and all too familiar. They were the faces of the people who worked in my office. No, this isn't real," I muttered, stumbling back. The shadows whispered again, their voices overlapping. This time, I could make out the words. "You saw us. You called us. Now you belong to us." The air grew heavier, pressing down on me like a physical weight. My limbs felt sluggish, my vision blurred. I backed into one of the shelves, knocking over a display of canned goods. The noise echoed unnaturally, the sound twisting and distorting as it faded into silence. The shadows surrounded me, cutting off every escape. They loomed closer, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. One of them reached out, its tendrils brushing against my arm. It was cold. So cold it burned. I screamed and lashed out with the box cutter, slicing through the tendril. The shadow recoiled with a guttural hiss, but it wasn't enough to stop it. More shadows closed in, their forms merging into a single towering mass. It loomed over me, its surface rippling with the faces of the lost. Then, the voice came again, deeper this time, resonating in my very bones. "You looked where you shouldn't have. Now you will see." The mass surged forward, engulfing me. The darkness was absolute, suffocating. I couldn't see, couldn't breathe. The whispers were deafening now, filling my mind with a cacophony of despair. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, I was back in the office. The monitors glowed softly, displaying the same empty hallways and cubicles as before. The coffee cup on my desk was still warm, the clock on the wall ticking quietly. Had it all been a dream? I reached for the mouse to check the security feed, but froze. My hand didn't move. I looked down and saw why. It wasn't my hand. It was a shadow, its edges rippling, attached to a body that wasn't mine. I turned toward the monitor, and the reflection in the dark screen confirmed it. I wasn't me anymore. Somewhere deep inside, I screamed, but no one would ever hear. Have you ever heard a sound so hauntingly beautiful it made you stop breathing? It was late when I first found it, tucked away in the attic of the old house I'd just inherited. The house had belonged to my grandmother, a quiet woman with a penchant for collecting odd trinkets. Among the cobwebs and forgotten memories was a small wooden box, its surface intricately carved with vines and flowers that seemed to dance in the dim light of my flashlight. I picked it up carefully. It was heavier than it looked, the wood polished but worn with age. A delicate key jutted from its side. A music box, I murmured, brushing off the layer of dust. Curiosity got the better of me, and I wound the key slowly. The mechanism clicked softly, but no sound emerged. Disappointed, I set it aside and continued sorting through the clutter. That night, as I lay in bed, I heard it for the first time. The melody was faint, barely audible over the rustle of the wind outside. At first, I thought it was coming from somewhere in the neighborhood, perhaps someone playing an old piano. But as I sat up and strained to listen, I realized the sound was closer. Much closer. It was coming from the attic. A chill ran down my spine. I grabbed my phone and made my way upstairs, each creak of the wooden steps echoing in the silence. The attic was just as I had left it, filled with boxes and forgotten trinkets. But there, on the dusty floor, was the music box. It was open. The melody played softly, the notes delicate and melancholic, filling the room with an eerie, almost tangible presence. I hadn't opened it earlier. I was sure of that. I crouched beside it, the music tugging at something deep inside me, a strange mix of nostalgia and unease. The tiny ballerina inside spun slowly, her movements jerky, as if struggling against unseen resistance. Maybe the mechanism was stuck, I whispered to myself, though the explanation felt hollow. I closed the lid, cutting off the sound abruptly, and carried the box downstairs. Placing it on the mantel in the living room, I resolved to inspect it more closely in the morning. But that night, as I lay in bed, the melody returned. It was louder this time, clearer. The notes seemed to drift through the house, weaving into every corner. No matter how tightly I closed my eyes, I couldn't block it out. When I finally fell asleep, I dreamed of the ballerina. She wasn't spinning anymore. She was standing still, staring at me with hollow, painted eyes. I woke with a start, my heart racing, the melody still faintly echoing in my ears. The music box was on my nightstand. I hadn't brought it there. The morning light did little to calm my nerves. The music box sat on my nightstand, its intricate carvings catching the sunlight, making the delicate patterns almost shimmer. It looked harmless enough, but the events of the previous night gnawed at my mind. I reached for it hesitantly, half expecting it to burst into song. It didn't. The lid was closed, the tiny key still resting in its side. Just a dream, I muttered, but my voice lacked conviction. I decided to test it again. Turning the key slowly, I let it click 3 times before releasing it. The lid creaked open, and the melody began to play. The ballerina spun gracefully this time, her movements smooth and almost mesmerizing. I watched her for a moment before snapping the lid shut. The music stopped immediately. It was just a music box, I told myself. Nothing more. That night, the melody returned. It started just after midnight, faint at first, like a distant lullaby carried on the wind. But as the minutes ticked by, it grew louder, clearer, until it filled the entire house. I sat up in bed, clutching the blanket to my chest. My heart pounded as I listened, the notes twisting into something that felt almost alive. I wasn't alone. The realization hit me like ice water. I could feel it, a presence in the room, something watching me. My eyes darted to the music box. It was still on the nightstand, its lid slightly ajar, the melody spilling out like a whispered secret. "Stop it," I said aloud, my voice trembling. The music didn't stop. Summoning what little courage I had, I reached for the box and slammed the lid shut. The melody ceased, leaving behind a heavy silence that pressed against my ears. But the presence remained. I turned on the bedside lamp, flooding the room with warm light. Nothing seemed out of place, yet the air felt wrong, thick and heavy, like the atmosphere before a storm. I didn't sleep that night. The next morning, I decided to get rid of it. I drove to the edge of town, where the forest met an old, abandoned quarry. With the music box wrapped in a cloth, I hurled it as far as I could, watching it disappear into the dense trees. Relief washed over me as I drove home. It was gone. Or so I thought. That night, as the clock struck midnight, the melody returned. It was louder now, almost demanding, each note carrying a sense of urgency that sent chills down my spine. I bolted upright in bed, and there it was, sitting on the nightstand, just as before. The lid was open. The ballerina spun slowly, her painted face tilted toward me, her tiny hands raised as if reaching out. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "This isn't real." But it was. The melody grew louder, filling my ears, drowning out my thoughts. I covered my ears, but it didn't help. The music was inside my head, an inescapable symphony that refused to be silenced. And then I heard it. A voice. It was faint, hidden beneath the notes, but unmistakably there. A soft, mournful whisper that sent shivers down my spine. "Help me," it said. I stared at the music box, my pulse pounding in my ears. The ballerina's movements grew slower, her head tilting further, her hollow eyes fixed on mine. The voice came again, louder this time, clearer. "Help me." The lid slammed shut on its own, cutting off the melody. The room plunged into silence, but the voice lingered, echoing in my mind. I didn't sleep again that night. I spent the next day pacing the house, my thoughts circling the same questions. Who, or what, was calling out from the box? Was I losing my mind? I tried to distract myself, but the silence of the house was unbearable. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint rustle of the wind felt like a harbinger of something I couldn't understand. By sunset, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed the music box and placed it on the dining table, determined to confront it. "All right," I said aloud, my voice trembling. "What do you want from me?" The box didn't respond, of course. It sat there, its intricate carvings catching the fading light. But as the room grew darker, I felt it again, the presence. The air grew colder, the shadows stretching unnaturally across the walls. The melody began to play on its own. I froze, staring as the lid creaked open and the ballerina emerged, spinning slowly to the haunting tune. The notes were different this time, sharper, faster, as if in a frantic plea. "Help me," the voice whispered again, clearer now. I leaned closer, my breath shallow. "Who are you?" The ballerina's movement stuttered, her tiny arms trembling. The whisper grew louder, almost desperate. "Help me, set me free." The room plunged into darkness. The only light came from the music box, a faint, eerie glow that illuminated the ballerina's painted face. Her expression had changed. Her once blank eyes now looked sorrowful, pleading. I reached out, my fingers brushing the edge of the box. The moment I touched it, the room shifted. I was no longer in my dining room. I stood in a vast, empty hall, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The walls stretched endlessly into the void, adorned with faded murals of people whose faces were blurred, their features twisted into expressions of fear. The melody played here, too, echoing through the space, but it sounded distant, distorted. Where am I? I called out, my voice swallowed by the oppressive silence. A figure emerged from the shadows, a woman, her form translucent, her movements slow and hesitant. She looked familiar, her features sharp and hauntingly beautiful. You found the box, she said, her voice the same as the one that had whispered to me in the night. Who are you? I demanded, stepping back. She raised a hand, and the melody grew louder, the walls trembling with its force. I am trapped, she said, her voice filled with sorrow. Bound to this box, this melody, for what I have done. What do you mean? What did you do? She didn't answer immediately. Her gaze dropped, her form flickering like a candle's flame. I made a deal, she said finally, her voice barely audible. I played the melody to protect myself, to save what I loved. But the price was my freedom. Now, the melody binds me, and it will bind you too, unless you set me free. I stared at her, my mind racing. How? How do I free you? The walls began to close in, the air growing colder. Her figure flickered again, her expression turning frantic. You must destroy it, she said, her voice rising. Burn the box before the melody stops, before it claims you too. The hall dissolved around me, and I was back in my dining room, the music box still playing its haunting tune. I grabbed it with trembling hands, my heart pounding. The ballerina spun faster, her movements wild, the melody reaching a fever pitch. Destroy it, the voice screamed, no longer mournful but filled with terror. But as I turned toward the fireplace, the melody shifted once more, and another voice emerged, this one darker, colder, dripping with malice. Don't listen to her, it hissed. She's lying. I froze, the music box growing heavier in my hands. The two voices overlapped, their words clashing as the melody swirled around me. One pleading, one commanding, and I didn't know which one to believe. The voices clashed, their words swirling around me like a storm. Burn it, the first voice cried, desperate and trembling. Free us both. Keep it, the darker voice hissed, low and commanding. Her freedom is your doom. I tightened my grip on the music box, its surface growing unnaturally warm. The ballerina inside spun faster, her tiny figure trembling as though she might shatter at any moment. What happens if I destroy it? I demanded aloud, my voice breaking. The first voice faltered. I will be free, but you may see what I have seen. And if I don't? The second voice chuckled, a deep, chilling sound. Then you live, for now. But she will drag you into her torment, piece by piece, note by note. The melody twisted, the once haunting tune now discordant and sharp. The air around me felt heavy, oppressive, and the shadows in the room seemed to move, creeping closer. I stumbled back, my mind racing. What if they were both lying? What if this was some cruel game, and I was just a pawn? The fireplace crackled faintly, the only other sound in the room. I glanced at it, the flames beckoning. The voices grew louder, fighting for dominance. "She's a liar," the darker voice roared. "She's not innocent, she's the one who played the melody first." "No," the woman's voice cried, her sorrow cutting through the chaos. "I was tricked, just like you. Please, I can't stay here forever." The weight of the box increased, the carvings now hot against my skin. The ballerina's spinning slowed, her figure jerking unnaturally as the melody reached its final notes. "Hurry," the woman's voice pleaded. "The melody is almost done. Once it ends, it will begin again, and the cycle will never stop." I moved toward the fireplace, the flames reflecting in the polished surface of the box. My heart pounded as I raised it above the fire. "Do it," the woman urged. "Don't," the dark voice growled, sharp and icy. "Once it's gone, there is no going back. You will bear the weight of her choice. Forever." I hesitated, the heat from the flames licking at my hands. The room seemed to tilt, the walls bending and twisting as though the house itself was alive. Then I made my decision. The music box hit the fire, the flames engulfing it immediately. The melody screeched, twisting into a terrible wail that made me stagger back. The ballerina's figure melted, her painted face warping into a scream as the box cracked and splintered. The shadows in the room recoiled, twisting and writhing before they disappeared into the floor. For a moment, everything was silent. Then, a faint whisper. "Thank you," the woman's voice said, soft and fading. The flames consumed the last of the box, and the oppressive weight in the air lifted. The room felt lighter, the silence almost too loud after the chaos. I collapsed into a chair, trembling, my hands still warm from the fire. But as the minutes passed, I began to notice something strange. The house was too quiet. The clock on the wall had stopped. The distant hum of the refrigerator was gone. Even the faint rustle of the wind outside had vanished. And then I heard it. A single note, soft and distant, like the faint echo of a memory. The melody was beginning again. Inside my head, I froze. The sound was faint, almost imperceptible at first. A single note, lingering like a whispered promise. I looked around, my heart pounding. The room, the house, everything seemed unchanged, yet the air felt wrong. The quiet had turned oppressive, as if the very walls were holding their breath. Then the note repeated, louder this time. It was coming from inside me. The music was no longer just a sound, it had become a presence. A force that pressed against my thoughts, filling every corner of my mind with its twisted melody. I pressed my hands to my ears, trying to block it out, but it was too late. The music seeped into my consciousness, taking root. "Make it stop," I gasped, my voice breaking. "Please, make it stop." But no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape it. The melody had taken hold. I stumbled through the house, searching for anything that could stop the sound. I tried locking the doors, closing the windows, even burying my head beneath pillows, but the music followed me. It pulsed in my chest, a relentless rhythm I couldn't outrun. As I collapsed on the floor, gasping for breath, I realized the terrible truth. It wasn't just the box that had been cursed, it was me. The melody was mine now, its notes twisted into my very soul. I had made the choice when I destroyed the box, when I had listened to the voices. I had broken the cycle, but in doing so, I had become part of it. The house around me seemed to fade, the walls blurring at the edges as the sound grew louder, overwhelming. It was the only thing left. And then, Just when I thought I might lose myself to the music completely, I heard it. The voice, faint but unmistakable. "Thank you." It was her. The woman from the music box. Her voice was no longer sorrowful, no longer pleading. It was calm. "Thank you for setting me free." The melody shifted. The notes softened like the final breath of a long, drawn-out sigh. It slowed, stretched thin like a thread ready to snap. And then it stopped. The silence that followed was deafening. I don't know how long I sat there, the emptiness settling around me. The music was gone. The voices were silent. The weight that had filled my mind had lifted, leaving only an unsettling quiet. I stood up, my legs shaky. The house was unchanged, yet something felt different, emptier, somehow. I looked at the mantel, where the remnants of the music box had been. There was nothing left now, no ashes, no broken pieces. Just a faint, lingering sense of loss. The door opened by itself, a cold wind sweeping in from the outside. I didn't know what would happen next. I didn't know if the melody would return or if it was truly gone for good. But for the first time since the music box had entered my life, I felt free. At least, I thought I did. Then, as I turned to leave, I heard it again. A single note. And with it, a voice. "Thank you." But it wasn't hers this time. It was mine. It's funny how a single letter can change everything. Have you ever received something in the mail that makes you question the very nature of reality? I never thought I would until I found that letter. But what if you were the one who wrote it and then completely forgot? I wasn't expecting anything unusual in the mail that morning. Bills, junk mail, the usual. But then, wedged between a couple of advertisements, was an envelope that stood out. It was old-fashioned, yellowed at the edges, with a crinkly texture as though it had been handled many times. There was no return address, only my name, scribbled in what looked like familiar handwriting. I didn't recognize the handwriting at first, but something about it felt strange. The name on the envelope, my name, was there, but the more I stared at it, the more I felt as though I should know whose handwriting it was. I opened it carefully. Inside was a single piece of paper. The letter read, "Do you remember me? I never stopped thinking about you, even when you thought you were alone. I've been watching, waiting for the right time to reach out again. I never left, not really." At the bottom of the letter, there was a single name, written in bold letters, Jacob. I froze. Jacob. That name. It stirred something deep inside me, a distant memory I couldn't quite place. It was as though I had known this person, or perhaps had imagined him. The more I thought about it, the more unsettling it became. Jacob was the name of my childhood invisible friend. He was the one I created as a child when I felt lonely, a companion who comforted me during those long, quiet days. But that was years ago, long before I'd left for college, before life had become filled with responsibilities and distractions. I had completely forgotten about Jacob. Or so I thought. The letter continued. I remember the nights we spent together, talking, laughing. I remember how scared you were, but I promised you then that you would never be alone. I know things are different now, but I'm still here. Maybe you've forgotten, but I never have. The room felt colder as I read the words. The air seemed to shift, the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen suddenly loud against the silence. I looked around, half expecting to see a shadow move in the corner of my vision. I shook my head, trying to laugh it off. This is ridiculous. It's just some prank. Someone's messing with me. But deep down, I knew it wasn't a prank. There was something far too familiar about the words. I had never told anyone about Jacob, not even my closest friends. Who could have known? I sat down at my kitchen table, trying to make sense of what I had just read. I looked at the letter again, hoping that somehow there would be an explanation, a logical reason for this. But the letter remained the same, its words staring at me, mocking me. Then I heard it. A soft sound, like a whisper. I glanced toward the doorway, but there was no one there. Hello? I called out, my voice trembling slightly. There was no answer. The whisper faded, and the room fell silent again. I stood up, moving toward the window, looking out into the street below. I needed to calm down. It was just my imagination. But then, from behind me, I heard it again. A soft laugh, a quiet, familiar sound. I spun around, my heart pounding. There, standing in the corner of the room, was a shadow. It was a shape, but not fully formed. It flickered, like a distortion in the air. The shape seemed to smile at me. Jacob. The name rang in my head like a bell. It was as if the world itself had changed, and I was standing on the edge of something I could barely comprehend. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. The letters, the laughter, the shadow, it all pointed to him. But how? How was this possible? As I stood frozen in place, the figure in the corner seemed to grow more defined. I could almost make out the outline of a face, a boyish grin that I hadn't seen in years. Jacob? I whispered, my voice barely audible. The shadow nodded, or at least, it seemed to. I never left, the voice said, a soft murmur that echoed in the stillness of the room. The room grew colder, the air thick with an unseen pressure. The walls seemed to close in, and for a moment, I was filled with the sensation of being watched, not by one pair of eyes, but by countless, unseen pairs. I couldn't breathe. The shadow in the corner was growing, its edges darkening, its presence becoming overwhelming. I never forgot you, Jacob's voice continued. You were never truly alone. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. The shadow was moving toward me now, slow and deliberate, as though it was alive. What had I brought back with that letter? What had I awoken? I reached for my phone, my hands trembling as I fumbled to dial a number, but I couldn't take my eyes off the shadow. It was getting closer, and I could hear its voice again, a whisper that sounded too close to my ear. You always knew I was real, didn't you? You always knew, even when you tried to forget. And that was when the phone rang. The ring echoed through the silence, sharp and jarring. My hand froze, still gripping the phone. The shadow in the corner of the room was only a few feet away now. Its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I swallowed hard, staring at the phone screen. The number was unfamiliar, an unknown caller. My breath caught in my throat as I debated whether to answer. But the shadow didn't wait. It moved closer, its form blurring and shifting like smoke in the air. I could feel the temperature drop even more, the chill sinking deep into my bones. The whispering intensified. I answered the phone, voice shaky. Hello? There was a long pause, just the sound of breathing. Then the voice spoke, its tone familiar, almost comforting. Did you miss me? My heart stopped. It was Jacob. But it wasn't just his voice. There was something else, something deeper, a layer of distortion I couldn't place. Jacob, I breathed, my voice cracking. Where are you? The whispering stopped. The shadows seemed to freeze for a moment as if it had heard my words. I'm right here, came the voice from the phone, now faintly distorted, like it was coming from a great distance. I've always been with you, haven't I? All these years. The shadow surged forward suddenly, and I stumbled backward, barely able to keep my balance. The air felt thick, pressing in from all sides, and I could no longer tell where the figure ended and the room began. It felt as if the walls themselves were folding in around me, closing off any escape. Jacob! I shouted, my voice trembling. What do you want from me? A cold, disembodied laugh filled the room. It wasn't just one voice now, it was a chorus, layering over each other, growing louder. The sound of children laughing, echoing in the corners of my mind. The shadows seemed to flicker, and in that instant, I saw a face. It was my face. It was me, only twisted, distorted, eyes too wide, a grin too sharp. It looked like a version of me that had been forgotten, buried in the past. I never left, the voice whispered again, this time from everywhere. I've always been here. I turned and ran, my legs weak beneath me. I had to get out, had to escape, but it felt like the room itself was moving with me, closing in. The phone slipped from my hand as I bolted for the door. But when I reached it, the door wouldn't open. It was as if the world had locked itself away. I turned back to the room, gasping for breath, and the shadow was there, right in front of me. The room was spinning, and I felt like I was suffocating under its weight. You tried to forget me, the voice echoed, but you can't. You never could. And then, suddenly, the shadow reached out. I woke up with a start, heart racing, drenched in sweat. My hands were shaking, and the room was still. It was morning. The sunlight filtered in through the curtains, the world outside peaceful and calm. I sat up, trying to catch my breath, unsure if I had been dreaming or if something more sinister had happened. I looked around the room, expecting to see signs of the night's terror, but there was nothing. No shadow, no distorted figure. The air was warm and still, just like it always had been. I grabbed the phone from the nightstand, checking for any missed calls. There was nothing. No calls. No messages. Just silence. I sighed, feeling the tension begin to ease. Maybe I had just imagined it all. Maybe it was just stress, or some twisted memory of childhood manifesting in a nightmare. But then I saw it. A new envelope, sitting on the kitchen counter. It was the same yellow paper. Same handwriting. This time, the message was different. You still don't remember, do you? I'm always just a letter away. And at the bottom, in bold, the same name. Jacob. The whispering started again. The air in the room grew thick once more, like the weight of the past had returned, lingering in the corners of the space. My heart pounded in my chest, each beat louder than the last. The letter on the kitchen counter stared at me, taunting me with its message. I felt a chill creeping up my spine, a feeling that something unseen was watching me, waiting. I stood frozen for a moment, unsure whether I should approach the letter. What if it was real? What if Jacob, my imaginary friend from childhood, was still here, somehow, somewhere, just waiting for me to acknowledge him? The memories I had tried so hard to bury were clawing their way back to the surface. I stepped forward, my hand trembling as I reached for the envelope. I pulled it open slowly, almost afraid of what I might find inside. The letter inside was short, its words sharp and deliberate. You never understood, did you? It's not just memories that bind us. You created me for a reason, and now I am real. I felt my breath catch in my throat. The words blurred before my eyes, the realization dawning upon me slowly, painfully. Jacob wasn't just some figment of my imagination, something I had dreamed up for comfort in my loneliness. He was something more. Something alive. I stepped back, the room spinning. I could feel the walls closing in on me again. The space seemed to shrink, the air growing colder with each passing second. And then the whispering started. It wasn't just a sound anymore. It was a presence, something that surrounded me, that reached into my mind and twisted every thought. The air seemed to pulse with the rhythm of a distant melody, faint at first, but growing louder, closer. The music. The same melody I had heard in my nightmares, the one I couldn't quite place, but now I knew. It was the sound of something watching me, something waiting to consume me. The same melody I had heard when I was a child, when Jacob and I would sit together, pretending we were the only two people in the world. But now, the music wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. I looked around, desperate to find some escape, but there was nowhere to go. The room was no longer just a room. It was a prison, closing in on me from all sides. Jacob? I whispered, my voice cracking. What do you want from me? The whispering stopped. For a moment, there was only silence. Then, the voice answered, low and guttural, as if it came from deep within the walls themselves. I want you to remember. And just like that, everything changed. The room seemed to twist, the walls warping and undulating like liquid. The air grew thick, almost suffocating, as the shadows in the corners of the room began to move. They stretched and shifted, taking shape, forming into something else. I blinked, and for a moment, I could see Jacob. But not as he was when I was a child. No, this was a version of him that was older, more twisted. His smile was too wide, too sharp, and his eyes gleamed with a hunger that made my blood run cold. He reached out to me, his hands stretching impossibly far, his fingers curling like claws. Remember, I never left. I was always here, waiting. And then, everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying on the floor, my head throbbing. The room was still and quiet. The oppressive atmosphere had lifted, but the air still felt heavy, as if it was charged with some unseen force. I sat up, disoriented, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I looked around the room, but everything seemed normal again. The walls were no longer closing in, and the shadows were no longer moving. It was as if the nightmare had ended, but something still felt off. I stood up shakily, my legs weak beneath me. I tried to steady myself, but my thoughts were racing. What had just occurred? Was it all just a dream? But then I saw it. On the table, beside me, was another letter. The handwriting was the same. Familiar. You've come so far. But you still don't understand. I'm here. I'm waiting. I always will be. I closed my eyes, a wave of nausea washing over me. The melody played again, faint but clear, as though it was coming from somewhere deep within my mind. The music. I knew it now. It wasn't a sound I could escape from. It was the rhythm of my life, the echo of something long forgotten but never truly gone. Jacob was real. And no matter how hard I tried, no matter how far I ran, I couldn't escape him. He would always be with me. Always. The world outside seemed to continue, unaffected, as I stood frozen in my living room, the letter still in my hand. My pulse was racing, each beat deafening in the silence that hung in the air. The weight of the words on the paper was suffocating, each one a reminder that there was no escape. Jacob had never left, and now he was here again. The music played in my mind, a haunting melody that wouldn't let me go. It seemed to echo from the very core of my being, vibrating through the walls, the floors, the very air. It wasn't just a sound, it was a feeling, an imprint, something that dug deep into my consciousness and refused to fade. I sank back onto the couch, gripping the letter tightly in my hands. The room felt small, as though the walls were inching closer with every breath I took. I tried to steady my thoughts, but they were spiraling out of control. How was this happening? How had Jacob, a figment of my childhood, returned? I closed my eyes, trying to calm myself, but the melody kept playing. Soft at first, almost distant, but growing louder. It was like a lullaby, but instead of comforting, it was terrifying. Suddenly, the air shifted. The silence around me felt too thick, too charged. The whispering began again, a chorus of voices this time, faint at first, then louder, until it was all I could hear. They were speaking in unison, a jumbled mass of words that made no sense. But underneath it all, there was something familiar. Remember. I jolted upright, the whispering fading instantly. For a brief moment, everything went still. But then the doorbell rang. I froze, my body tense. The sound of it was sharp, intrusive. My pulse quickened again, my breath shallow. Who could be at the door? I hadn't been expecting anyone. I slowly stood, my legs trembling beneath me. The doorbell rang again, more urgently this time. I had no choice. I had to answer it. I approached the door, each step feeling like it took forever. The air around me felt thick, oppressive. As I reached for the doorknob, my hand was shaking uncontrollably. I hesitated, my mind racing. What would I find on the other side? Taking a deep breath, I opened the door. There was no one there. I looked down at the doorstep. And there, lying in the dirt, was a small box. I bent down cautiously and picked it up. The box was old, its wood chipped and worn. The edges were delicate, almost fragile, as though it had been sitting in the dirt for years. I turned it over in my hands. No name, no label. Just a small, intricately carved design on the top. I hesitated for only a moment before I opened it. Inside was a music box. The same one I had imagined when I was a child. The one Jacob and I had always played with together. My breath caught in my throat as I stared at it. The memories surged forward, flooding my mind. I remembered the way Jacob's laughter had sounded as we turned the key together, the soft, familiar melody that played each time the box opened. It had always been a source of comfort back then. But now, it felt like a warning. I slowly turned the key, my hands shaking. The melody started to play. The familiar tune echoed through the silence, its soft, gentle notes at first. But as the song played, I felt a chill crawl down my spine. The notes seemed to stretch, to distort, until they no longer sounded sweet. They sounded wrong. The song grew louder, twisting and warping, until it felt like the very room was vibrating with its power. I clutched the box tightly, unable to stop myself. And then, just as it had in my dream, the music stopped. I looked up, my heart pounding in my chest. The room was still, too still. The shadows in the corners of the room had deepened, stretching across the walls like dark fingers. And in the center of the room, there was a figure. It was Jacob, but not like I remembered him. He was taller, his features twisted and unrecognizable, his eyes black as night. He stood in the doorway, smiling, only it wasn't a smile. It was a grin, too wide, too sharp. His mouth opened, and I could hear that familiar voice, distorted and hollow. "You forgot me, but I never forgot you." I stumbled backward, dropping the music box. The sound of it hitting the floor was drowned out by the growing laughter, the sound of something that shouldn't be. And then, everything went dark. I woke up with a start, gasping for air, my heart racing. My body felt stiff, as though I had been lying in the same position for hours, but everything around me was shrouded in a strange, suffocating stillness. I blinked several times, trying to focus, but the room was dark, almost unnaturally so. I sat up, my hands trembling, trying to make sense of what had just happened. The events from earlier seemed like a hazy dream, but the lingering fear in my chest told me it was all too real. The music, Jacob, the twisted figure in the doorway, it had all felt so tangible, so haunting. I stood up slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and looked around. The room was unchanged, nothing was out of place. The same walls, the same furniture. But something was different. The silence felt louder now. The absence of sound was deafening. It was as if every part of the world had stilled, holding its breath. And then I heard it. The faintest echo of the melody. My breath caught in my throat. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but then it grew louder, the familiar tune of the music box filling the room once again. I turned toward the sound, and there, on the table, was the music box. It wasn't there before, I was sure of it. I hadn't left it out. But there it was, as if it had always been there, waiting for me. I took a hesitant step toward it. The melody grew clearer, more distinct, each note pulling me closer. It was soothing in its way, but beneath the surface, there was something unsettling about it. I reached for the box, my fingers brushing its surface. The cold would send a shock through my skin. It felt wrong. I opened the lid, my hands moving of their own accord. The melody began, soft and eerie, playing as if it had never stopped. And then, the voice came again. "You can't escape me." I froze, my blood running cold. The voice, Jacob's voice, was too close, too real. But there was no one else in the room. The shadows in the corners of the room began to shift, swirling around the edges of my vision. I could feel them moving, stretching, growing. They were no longer just shadows. They were figures, dark and twisted, reaching out toward me. I tried to run, but my legs felt heavy, as if the air had thickened, making every step a struggle. The music played louder, the sound drowning out all other thoughts. I could hear it in my mind now, as if it were inside my very soul. "You can't escape me," the voice repeated, its tone a cruel mockery of my fear. I turned toward the door, but it was gone. The room had changed again. The walls were closing in on me, the floor beneath my feet shifting, as if the house itself was alive, consuming me. And in the center of it all, Jacob stood, his form more distinct now, no longer a shadow but a solid figure. His eyes glowed darkly, an endless abyss that drew me in. He was smiling, the grin stretched wide, stretching beyond what was humanly possible. "You were always mine," he said, his voice a twisted lullaby. I wanted to scream, but no sound came. I tried to run, but the shadows reached out, pulling me back. The walls seemed to close in tighter, the music becoming deafening. In that moment, I understood. This wasn't just a game. Jacob wasn't just a figment of my childhood. He was something much darker, something ancient. And I had unwittingly invited him back into my life. I fell to my knees, my chest heaving as the melody played on. "It's time to remember," Jacob whispered. The music box continued to play, its notes spinning out of control, and then, suddenly, there was a final, chilling note. A sharp, discordant sound that cut through everything. And with that, everything went silent. The world around me ceased to exist. The room, the walls, the shadows, all of it disappeared. There was nothing but darkness. No music. No voice. Just silence. Have you ever looked into a mirror only to feel like something is watching you back? Not your reflection, but something else, something just beyond the surface. Something that shouldn't be there. It was a cold night when I first noticed it, a night like any other. The streets were empty, save for the occasional passing car and the faint hum of streetlights casting their dull glow. I had just finished a late meeting and was walking home, the cold air biting at my skin. My feet moved automatically, not in a hurry but with purpose, as I passed the rows of shops still lit with neon signs. The city was quiet, almost unnaturally so, as if holding its breath. I passed by a shop window, its glass slick with condensation, when I noticed something strange. The reflection in the glass wasn't mine, not entirely, anyway. At first, I thought it was just the angle, the dim lighting playing tricks on my eyes. But no! It was a city, a whole other place. The buildings behind me, the street I was standing on, weren't reflected in the glass. Instead, I saw an unfamiliar street stretching into the distance, lined with buildings I didn't recognize. They were tall and dark, towering over the street in a way that felt wrong, as if they had been plucked from an old photograph and placed into the present. The street was eerily silent, devoid of life. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and stepped closer to the window. The image wavered, as if the glass itself was shifting before it steadied. There was no mistaking it now. This wasn't just a trick of the light. There was a whole other city in the reflection. I leaned forward, pressing my hands against the cold glass, studying the scene. The buildings were draped in shadows, their outlines sharp and defined. But something about the colors, the way the shadows clung to the structures, felt unnatural. It was as if the city was being swallowed by the night, inch by inch. I stood there for a long moment, my breath fogging up the glass as I stared into the reflection. A part of me knew I should move on, keep walking, ignore the strange sight, and pretend nothing had happened. But another part of me, something deep inside, urged me to look closer. And so, I did. As I peered into the window, I noticed something else, something out of place. There, in the distance, on a lamppost, was a faded poster. The edges of the paper were curling, the ink long since faded, but I could still make out the image. It was a poster for some event I didn't recognize, but that wasn't the most unsettling part. The most unsettling part was the face on the poster. It was mine. There, on the paper, was a younger version of me. I could tell it was me. There was no mistaking it. But how? How could this poster exist in a city I had never seen, a city that seemed to exist in a world entirely separate from my own? I took a step back, my heart hammering in my chest. The reflection was gone now, replaced by my own face staring back at me through the glass, just as it should have been. But the image of the poster lingered in my mind, its eerie presence still hanging in the air. Was it a sign? A coincidence? Or had I somehow slipped into a different world without realizing it? I didn't have the answers, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just scratched the surface of something much bigger, something that I wasn't meant to see. And as I walked away from the window, I couldn't help but feel like the city around me had changed. Not physically, but in some way that was impossible to put into words. The air felt heavier, the streetlights dimmer. Something was watching, something that shouldn't have been there. And it was only just beginning. The walk home felt different now. It wasn't just the city that had changed, but the way I saw it. The buildings seemed taller, the shadows darker, and the air itself felt thick, like it was closing in on me. My footsteps echoed louder in the empty street, and every car that passed seemed to be going a little too fast, the drivers too focused, too unaware of the world around them. I couldn't stop thinking about that poster. How could it have been there, in a city that wasn't mine? I didn't know the event, the date, or the place, but the face, my face, stared back at me, as if it had always been there, as if it belonged. When I got home, I immediately went to my desk, sat down, and turned on my computer. The image of the poster wouldn't leave my mind. I needed to know more. I needed to understand what was going on. Maybe it was some kind of mistake, some sort of trick of the light or the glass, but the more I thought about it, the more I realized that I had to see it again. I searched for anything that might explain the strange city in the reflection, but found nothing. There were no reports of any unusual happenings, no strange disappearances, no incidents that could explain the reflection I had seen. Nothing that matched the city or the poster. I clicked through search results for hours, trying to find some connection, but everything kept leading to dead ends. The city wasn't listed anywhere, the event didn't exist, and the image of the poster was a ghost in the digital world. It was as if the city, and everything in it, didn't belong to the same reality as mine. As the hours ticked by, fatigue settled in. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my eyes. The room was dimly lit by the soft glow of my computer screen, and I felt a growing unease. The feeling from earlier, the one that something was watching, came back. I tried to shake it off, but it lingered. It was then that I heard the sound of something shifting in the distance. I froze. It wasn't the usual creaks of an old building settling or the hum of the fridge in the kitchen. This sound was different. It was faint, barely perceptible, but it felt like a presence moving in and out of the shadows. I turned my head to the window, but nothing was there. The street was dark and quiet, the only light coming from the street lamps casting long, eerie shadows on the sidewalk. I couldn't explain it, but the sound kept getting closer, like footsteps. Slow, deliberate steps, pacing back and forth outside my window. I stood up and moved cautiously toward the window, my heart pounding in my chest. The blinds were drawn, but there was a small gap between them, just enough to see out onto the street. I pulled them back slightly, my breath caught in my throat. Nothing. The street was still empty. There was no one there, no footsteps, no sound. The night was still. But the feeling was there again. That sense of being watched. The realization hit me like a wave. I wasn't alone. I turned away from the window, trying to shake the unease creeping up my spine. But as I moved back to my desk, something caught my eye, a small glimmer on the edge of the desk. It was a letter. I hadn't noticed it before, but now, there it was. It looked ordinary at first, plain white envelope, No markings, no return address. But when I picked it up, I felt a chill run down my back. The handwriting on the front was neat, familiar. It was a name I hadn't seen in years, my own. I tore the envelope open, hands trembling, and pulled out the letter inside. The paper felt old, like it had been stored away for a long time. I unfolded it carefully. The message was simple, but it sent a shiver through me. I'm watching. I know what you've seen. It's not just a reflection. It's real. The letter had no signature, no further explanation. Just those words. I stood there in silence, the weight of the message sinking in. It didn't make sense. Who could have sent this? And how did they know about the reflection, about the city I had seen? I felt a strange urge to go back to that window, to look again, but fear held me in place. What if the city was still there, staring back at me, waiting for me to acknowledge it again? What if that was exactly what they wanted? I didn't know what to do. The air around me seemed heavier now, the silence oppressive. I couldn't shake the feeling that the city, that reflection, was pulling me in, and that somehow it was reaching out to me. I had to find out more. I had to go back to the window. The night felt different as I stood by the window, staring out into the quiet street. The letter was still clenched in my hand, the words echoing in my mind. I'm watching. I know what you've seen. It's not just a reflection. It's real. What did that mean? And why had it been sent to me? I turned back to the window, the blinds still pulled back just enough for me to peer outside. The city around me looked as it always had, familiar yet somehow distant. The streets were empty, the buildings tall and silent. There was nothing out of place, no sign of the strange reflection I had seen earlier. But the unease lingered. I glanced down at the letter again. My name was written in that same neat, familiar handwriting. It was impossible to ignore. How could someone know about the reflection? How could they know about the city on the other side of the glass? The idea that something, or someone, was watching me began to settle into my bones, chilling every inch of my body. What if the reflection wasn't just a trick of the light, a momentary glitch in reality? What if the city I had seen truly existed, just beyond the glass, in some alternate reality that was slowly bleeding into mine? I couldn't let it go. I had to know more. I had to go back to the place where I first saw it. I grabbed my jacket, slipping the letter into the pocket, and left my apartment. The air outside was cold, sharp against my skin. The city was still, the only sound the occasional hum of distant traffic and the rustling of leaves in the wind. But I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being followed. It wasn't footsteps, not exactly, just a sense of movement behind me, like the air was shifting. I quickened my pace, heading back to the street where I had seen the reflection earlier. The buildings loomed taller now, their windows dark and empty, but something was different. The air felt heavier, like something unseen was pressing against the world. When I reached the spot, I stopped. The reflection was there again. Not the city I recognized, but something else, a city I couldn't place. The buildings were older, worn, as if time had passed differently there. There were no people in the windows, no movement, just empty streets. But the city, that strange, unfamiliar city, was waiting for me. I stepped closer to the glass, my breath fogging up the window. There, in the distance, was the same image I had seen before, the poster. It was almost exactly as I remembered, only this time, the details were clearer. My face stared back at me from the poster, the same familiar expression frozen in time. But something had changed. The poster was no longer just a piece of paper stuck to a wall. It seemed alive, shifting, as if the edges were curling and uncoiling like smoke. The image of me on the poster rippled, as if it was trying to break free from the surface, to reach through the glass and touch me. I recoiled, stepping back from the window, my heart pounding in my chest. This wasn't normal. This wasn't right. The city behind the glass wasn't just an illusion, it was something more, something I couldn't explain. And then, as I stood there, staring at the reflection, I saw something else. A shadow, moving across the street, walking toward the place where I stood. It wasn't a person. It was something else. The shape was too distorted, too unnatural to be a human figure. It moved with purpose, each step deliberate, as if it knew exactly where I was. I turned to run, but my legs wouldn't move. The air around me grew thick, heavy, like I was trapped in a thick fog. I could still see the shadow moving closer in the reflection, though. It was right there, right behind me, closing in. I had to get away. I had to break free. But as I turned to flee, I felt something cold brush against my shoulder. A whisper, like a voice just out of reach, calling my name. "You're not supposed to be here." I spun around, but there was nothing there. Just the same empty street, the same quiet night. But I could feel it, the presence, the eyes watching me, waiting for me to make a move. The city behind the glass, the reflection, it was calling me, drawing me in. It wanted me. I didn't know what to do. But I knew one thing for certain, the city on the other side was real. And it was not going to let me go. I don't know how long I stood there, paralyzed in place, the icy sensation of being watched crawling up my spine. The shadow behind me in the reflection hadn't moved, but I could feel its presence as clearly as I could feel the cold night air against my skin. It was closing in on me, drawing me toward the glass. I had to leave. The urge to run was overpowering, but my body still wouldn't obey. My feet were rooted to the ground as if the city itself had grown tendrils, tying me to this place. My mind screamed at me to move, to escape the oppressive feeling surrounding me, but something held me in place. It was the reflection, the city, something in that glass was pulling me in. I forced myself to take a step back, and then another, but I couldn't stop looking at the shadow in the reflection. It had stopped moving, but its form seemed to ripple, stretching and bending, as if trying to reach through the glass, toward me. And then, I saw it, a door, a narrow wooden door on the side of one of the buildings in the reflection. It wasn't there before. I would have noticed it. It was as though the city behind the glass had shifted, rearranged itself, just to give me a path, a doorway into whatever waited on the other side. The door stood in stark contrast to everything around it. It was simple, unadorned, yet I felt it calling me. I couldn't explain why, but something deep within me told me that I had to go through it, that I had no choice but to open it. I stepped toward the glass, my fingers trembling as they reached out. The chill of the night seemed to intensify, and I could hear my own heartbeat echoing in my ears. Every inch closer to the glass felt like I was stepping deeper into the unknown, into the heart of that strange city. And then, as if the reflection itself had become a tangible force, my hand touched the glass. There was no sudden shift in the world around me. No blinding flash of light or jarring sound. Instead, it was as if the glass had softened under my touch, melting like wax. I could feel it, cool, smooth, almost liquid, bending beneath my fingers. The reflection rippled. I pulled my hand back quickly, heart racing, but the glass remained pliable, as if it was beckoning me, inviting me to cross into whatever lay beyond. There was no time to think, no room for hesitation. My mind was numb, only a single thought remaining: I have to see what's on the other side. I took a breath and pushed my hand through the glass. It was as though I were thrusting my hand into ice-cold water. But there was no resistance. It wasn't liquid, not really, more like stepping into a thick, viscous substance that allowed my fingers to sink through. My breath caught in my throat as I felt something pulling me, a force strong and insistent. I wasn't sure if I was still in the same world, the same place. The sound of my heartbeat seemed to fade, drowned by an oppressive silence that filled every inch of my senses. The city around me was gone, the world itself slipping away as I moved deeper into the reflection. And then, just as I thought I might lose my balance, I was through. I stumbled forward, hitting solid ground with a jolt. The air smelled different here, stale, like old wood and dust. My surroundings were dark, but there was a faint glow coming from somewhere ahead, a dim light spilling out from behind an old, cracked door. The city I had seen through the glass was here, too. But it wasn't the city I had known, not in the slightest. The buildings were broken, dilapidated, as though time had forgotten this place. The streets were empty, devoid of life, save for the faint whisper of wind that swept through the alleys. I turned around, and to my surprise, the reflection was gone. The glass that had once shown me the doorway was now just an ordinary window, its surface cold and silent. I wasn't sure whether to feel relief or dread. I had crossed over, stepped into the city on the other side of the glass, but now that I was here, there was no sense of safety. Everything felt wrong, like I had intruded on a place that wasn't meant for me. The quiet hung heavy in the air, broken only by the sound of my own breathing. I walked cautiously down the street, the dim glow of the distant light guiding my steps. The buildings on either side of me were hunched over, as though they were watching, waiting. There was no sign of life, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. The further I walked, the more oppressive the silence became. It pressed against my skin, filling my ears with an almost unbearable ringing. I had to find out what was happening. I had to know who, or what, had sent me here. I reached the door, the one that had beckoned me from the reflection. My hand hovered over the handle, a deep sense of foreboding crawling up my spine. But there was no turning back now. I had come this far, and whatever waited on the other side of that door, whether it was salvation or horror, was the only way forward. I turned the handle and pushed the door open. As the door creaked open, a wave of cold air rushed past me, pulling me deeper into the unknown. The dim light from the street faded behind me, replaced by an eerie glow that seemed to emanate from nowhere in particular. It was like stepping into a place where time and space had no meaning, where the rules of reality twisted and bent with every step. I hesitated for a moment, my hand still gripping the door handle, but something urged me forward. The silence was suffocating, pressing against my chest with every breath I took. The air felt thick, heavy with the weight of unseen eyes, watching from the shadows. I stepped inside. The room was small, its walls lined with peeling wallpaper and the floor covered in dust. The faint glow that filled the space came from a single light bulb hanging from the ceiling, its filament flickering weakly. But what caught my attention wasn't the room itself, it was the reflection. A large mirror stood against the far wall, its frame ornate, carved with intricate patterns that seemed to shift if I looked at them for too long. The reflection in the mirror wasn't the same as the room I was standing in. It was brighter, clearer, more alive. The dust on the floor, the decay of the walls, they were all gone in their reflection. Instead, the room appeared pristine, untouched by time. But then, I saw it, the figure in the reflection. It was me. But not quite. The figure was taller, its features sharper, almost exaggerated. My eyes, no, not my eyes, stared back at me with an unsettling intensity, as though they knew things I didn't, things I wasn't ready to learn. The figure smiled, a slow, knowing grin that sent a chill racing through my body. I backed away from the mirror, my heart pounding in my chest. I tried to turn and leave the room, but the door slammed shut behind me with a deafening bang. The sound echoed in the silence, and the walls seemed to pulse with an energy I couldn't understand. The reflection in the mirror began to move. At first, it was just a subtle shift, like the figure was stretching, getting comfortable. But then, it began to move faster. It was walking toward the edge of the mirror, its steps deliberate, its grin widening with every step it took. It reached out, its hand pressing against the glass, and I swore I felt the temperature drop even further. I stumbled back, my legs shaking, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. There was something hypnotic about the reflection, something that made me want to step closer, to understand it, to become it. The figure's hand pressed harder against the glass, and then it stepped through. The mirror rippled like water, the surface distorting as the figure emerged, now standing in front of me. It was me, but it wasn't. The creature, the thing that wore my face, tilted its head, its smile twisting into something darker, more sinister. It reached out toward me, and I instinctively recoiled, but I couldn't move fast enough. It grabbed my arm. The moment its fingers touched my skin, a jolt of cold shot through my body, paralyzing me. I felt like my very essence was being pulled into the reflection, like I was being replaced. My vision blurred, and for a moment, I couldn't tell where the mirror ended and I began. And then, everything went black. I don't know how long I was unconscious. When I awoke, I was back in the street, the door behind me gone, the city completely silent. The reflection, the creature, had disappeared, leaving me alone once again. The world around me looked normal, but there was a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach, a sense that something was terribly wrong. I walked through the empty streets, the distant sound of my footsteps echoing in the silence. But as I passed the darkened windows, I couldn't help but glance at my reflection. And there, just for a second, I saw it. The figure. My reflection. It wasn't mine. It was still there, watching me from the other side, waiting. The realization hit me like a thunderclap. It wasn't just a reflection. It was a doorway. A doorway to another version of me, one that wasn't bound by the same rules, the same reality. And that version was still out there. Watching. Waiting. I didn't know if I would ever escape this city, or if the reflection would ever stop calling me back. All I knew was that it had taken something from me, something I would never get back. And I had no choice but to keep running. Have you ever been on a train that you didn't want to be on? A train that wouldn't stop? That was the situation I found myself in one cold, foggy evening. It started like any other ordinary day. I was heading home from work, tired after a long day of meetings and emails. The station was unusually quiet for that hour, with only a handful of passengers milling about. Most of them seemed to be in a hurry, their faces tired and distant. I didn't pay much attention until I noticed the train. It was unlike the others. The train that pulled into the station had no markings, no identifying features. It was just a sleek, dark steel structure, its windows reflecting the dim lights of the platform. For a moment, I hesitated. Something about it felt off, but the announcement came and I had no choice but to board. It was the only train going in the direction I needed. I stepped onto the train and found an empty seat near the middle. It was a typical train car, but there was an eerie stillness about it. No one spoke, and the air felt thick with a quiet, unsettling tension. As the doors closed, I couldn't help but notice that the platform outside was already slipping away, faster than usual. We were moving too quickly. I glanced around the car. The other passengers, who I had only just noticed, were all sitting perfectly still. Their eyes were fixed straight ahead, their hands resting in their laps. None of them moved, not even to acknowledge my presence. I tried to shake off the feeling of being watched, but it lingered. I pulled out my phone to distract myself, but there was no signal. Not even a flicker of connection. The train continued to speed through the darkening landscape, and the further we went, the more I felt a growing unease. The train was far too quiet, no clattering of the tracks, no hum of the engine. It felt like we were floating through space, completely removed from the world I knew. The other passengers remained motionless, their faces expressionless. The silence was deafening. A faint sound reached my ears, a soft, almost imperceptible rustling, like the whisper of paper. I turned to find this source, but there was nothing. Just the same, lifeless passengers, staring ahead. I shivered and tried to reassure myself that it was just the wind, or perhaps my imagination. But then, it happened again. The rustling grew louder, more distinct, and it seemed to come from behind me. I turned around in my seat, my heart pounding. The entire car was still, but the noise was unmistakable. It was as though someone, or something, was moving behind me. Slowly, I turned back to face the front of the car, but a cold sweat had already begun to form on my brow. There was no denying it now. Something was wrong. I watched as the train sped on, faster and faster, until I couldn't make out the scenery outside the windows. The world had disappeared into a blur of gray and black, leaving us in a void. I glanced at the other passengers again, but they were still the same. Still unmoving. Still silent. It felt as though the train was never going to stop, as though it had no destination, no purpose. And yet, the closer we got to the next station, the more I began to feel a pull, a sense that something terrible was about to happen. And that's when it struck me, there were no stops. No announcements, no platforms, no exits. We weren't going anywhere. I stood up, my hands trembling. The rustling sound grew louder, but I couldn't see the source. Every part of me screamed to leave, but where could I go? I glanced at the door, but it remained closed, locked. A feeling of panic crept into my chest, and I rushed to the nearest window, pounding my fist against it, hoping to break free. The glass didn't budge. I looked back at the passengers, their eyes still fixed on me. But now, they weren't just staring, they were watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. Their eyes bored into me, cold and empty. And then, one by one, they began to turn their heads, each of them slowly, deliberately, fixing their gaze on me. I was the only one who moved. The train rumbled on, and the quiet grew more suffocating. It felt like I was being swallowed by the endless void outside. Then the lights flickered. And I heard it. A voice. It was faint at first, barely audible over the hum of the train. But then it grew louder. Clearer. Why are you here? The words sent a jolt through my body. I spun around, looking for the source of the voice. but the passengers didn't speak. They just stared. "Why are you here?" it repeated, the voice now unmistakably coming from one of them. A man seated across the aisle from me. He was staring directly at me, his lips unmoving, yet the voice came from him. I froze, unable to respond. The train seemed to slow, and I could feel my heart beating faster. Was this a dream? Was I trapped in some kind of nightmare? "You shouldn't be here," the voice said again, but this time it sounded colder, more accusatory. The man's eyes narrowed, and I swore I saw a flicker of movement, a shift in his expression. Something was very wrong. The rustling behind me grew louder again, and I turned just in time to see a shadow moving swiftly across the aisle. It wasn't a person. It was something else. Something not right. I was trapped in a train that would never stop. And something was hunting me. I stumbled back into my seat, heart racing. I could feel my breath coming in shallow gasps as I tried to make sense of what was happening. My hands gripped the armrests so tightly that my knuckles turned white. The shadow I had glimpsed was now gone, but I couldn't shake the feeling that it was still there, just out of my sight, lurking in the darkness. I glanced around the car again. Every single passenger was still staring at me. Their eyes, cold, empty, unblinking, seemed to pierce right through me. I couldn't tell if they were human anymore. They looked like people, but there was something wrong with them. They weren't alive in the way I understood being alive. It was as if their souls had been drained, leaving only husks behind. The train rattled along the tracks, but there was no sound of movement outside. No passing landscapes. It was as if the world had ceased to exist beyond these walls. I turned to the door again, desperately hoping that somehow I could force my way out. But it was locked. I pounded my fists against the glass, screaming for someone to help, to let me out. But my voice felt muffled, as though the train itself was swallowing every sound I made. My reflection in the window stared back at me, a pale, desperate version of myself. No one heard me. I sank back into my seat, defeated. Sweat clung to my clothes, and I could feel the cold sweat gathering on my forehead. The air in the car felt thick and suffocating, almost as if the oxygen was being drained from the space. My head was spinning, and I had to close my eyes for a moment, trying to collect myself. When I opened them again, the train had changed. The lights flickered once more, casting strange, erratic shadows across the car. For a moment, I thought I saw a figure move, someone or something, faintly in the corner of my eye. But when I looked directly at it, there was nothing there. Just empty space. The passengers hadn't moved. They still stared at me with that same unsettling gaze, but now their faces seemed to have shifted ever so slightly. There was a faint sense of malice in their eyes, something cold and accusing. I couldn't understand why I felt so certain that they were all waiting for something, waiting for me to do something wrong. The train continued to accelerate, picking up speed in the most unnatural way. The world outside the window was nothing but a blur of dark shadows. And then I heard it. A sound from the back of the train, a soft, rhythmic thumping. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, but it grew louder, more distinct, until it was impossible to ignore. Thump, thump, thump. It was coming closer. I turned around, my body frozen in fear. In the distance, through the aisle, I saw a figure emerging from the darkness. It was tall, slender, and shrouded in shadow. I couldn't make out its features, but I could feel its presence, the heavy weight of it bearing down on me. I didn't move. I couldn't. My body was paralyzed by the overwhelming sense of dread. The thumping grew louder, closer now, until I could see it clearly, a figure walking down the aisle, its head bent at an unnatural angle, its arms hanging limp at its sides. It was a person, or at least it looked like one, but there was something deeply wrong about it. Its movements were jerky, unnatural, as if it was being pulled along by some unseen force. I closed my eyes, trying to block out the sight of it. But I couldn't. The thumping was right in front of me now. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck, and I dared not turn to face it. The figure stopped beside my seat. For a long moment, everything was still. My heart thudded in my chest, louder than the thumping of its footsteps. The air felt even thicker now, as though it was pressing in from all sides. And then, without a sound, the figure slowly lifted its head. I couldn't see its face, but I felt its gaze. Cold, empty, and hungry. It was staring at me. A voice, soft, barely a whisper, came from the figure's lips. "Why are you like the others?" I froze. The words were incomprehensible. What did it mean? What was it asking me? The figure moved closer, its body contorting unnaturally as it leaned in, its breath cold against my skin. I could hear it breathing, but it sounded wrong, too slow, too shallow, like it wasn't really breathing at all. "Why are you like the others?" it repeated, its voice growing sharper, more insistent. My mind raced. What did it mean? What was it saying? And then it hit me, the passengers. I looked around frantically, realizing that none of the other passengers had reacted. They were still sitting motionless, still staring at me with those cold, dead eyes. It was like they had all been frozen in time, stuck in a loop. They weren't just watching me. They were waiting. And the figure in front of me was asking why I wasn't like them. Why I hadn't become like them. I felt a rush of panic surge through my chest. The train was speeding faster and faster, and the world outside had disappeared into an endless void of darkness. I couldn't breathe. I couldn't move. I was trapped. And the worst part was, I could feel it. I was starting to change. The train had no stops. And neither would I. I could hear my own breathing now, shallow and desperate, as the figure hovered beside me. The rhythmic thumping of its footsteps had stopped, but the feeling of its presence lingered like a heavy weight pressing down on my chest. The air in the train car seemed even thicker now, suffocating. Every breath I took felt like I was inhaling the very darkness that surrounded me. Why are you like the others? The voice was soft but insistent, its words ringing in my ears, filling my mind with a terrible, unfamiliar weight. It wasn't a question anymore, it was an accusation. I didn't know how to answer. I didn't know what to say to something that wasn't quite human, to something that didn't seem bound by the rules of reality. The figure was still leaning over me, its face shrouded in shadow. I could feel its breath, cold and unnatural, against the side of my neck, but I refused to turn and look at it directly. I was afraid that if I did, it would somehow pull me into the dark, pull me into whatever this was. My hand moved instinctively to the window beside me. I pressed my palm against the glass, trying to ground myself, trying to find something, anything, that was familiar, that was real. The reflection in the window mirrored my movements, but as I stared into it, something began to change. The dark, blurred figures of the other passengers, who had been sitting still, unmoving, started to shift. They were no longer just passive observers. They moved, but not in a way that made sense. They didn't seem to walk or talk. They just shifted. I jerked my head away from the window, heart racing. What I had seen was impossible. The people weren't just staring at me now. They were looking at me. Their eyes blinked. Their bodies twitched. They were alive, and yet they weren't. They were no longer the passive, lifeless beings they had been when I first boarded the train. They were changing. And now they were all staring at me with an expression that I couldn't quite place, but it was one of judgment. The reflection was distorting, warping, becoming something sinister. The train car had transformed into something else, a twisted version of itself, like a dark mirror of reality. The figure beside me took another step forward, its presence growing more oppressive. The thumping sound had returned, but now I was joined by another noise, a faint scraping, like nails dragging along metal. I turned back to the aisle, trying to locate the source of the noise, but there was nothing. No one. I was trapped in a loop, a spiral I couldn't escape. And then, without warning, I heard a new voice. It was low, cold, and distant, but it filled the car like a fog. "We're waiting." The words echoed inside my skull, and for a moment, I thought I had imagined them. But then I felt it, the pressure of the eyes upon me, more intense than before. The passengers weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting for me to become like them. Waiting for me to accept that I was part of this place, part of this cursed train. I glanced down at my hands. They were trembling uncontrollably, my skin pale and clammy. But it wasn't just fear that gripped me. It was something deeper, something that felt like a whisper from a distant part of my mind, an urge to become one of them, to stop fighting, to accept the endless motion of the train, the never-ending journey through darkness. To give up and let the train take me wherever it wanted. To be just another soul lost in the void, another reflection in the glass. A soft rustle came from the back of the car. The scraping noise had stopped, replaced by a soft, whispering sound. I couldn't tell where it was coming from, but it was growing louder, closer. "Help me!" I screamed into the oppressive silence, my voice hoarse and frantic. "Please! Someone, anyone, help!" But the words fell flat, swallowed by the emptiness of the train. The passengers didn't react. The figure beside me didn't move. It just stood there, watching, its cold gaze drilling into me. It was waiting. They were all waiting. I looked back at the window, my reflection now distorted, changing with every second. The glass was no longer just a window, it was a barrier, an impossible wall between my reality and whatever nightmare this was. The reflection of the passengers in the window had taken on a new quality, their faces shifting into grotesque, hollow versions of themselves. I could see their lips moving, but no sound came out. Their eyes never left mine. And then I saw it. A flicker, a brief flash in the reflection. For a split second, I thought I saw a figure standing behind me, just over my shoulder. I turned, heart racing, but there was nothing there. But when I looked back at the window, it was different. There, in the reflection, was a new image. A poster. An old, weathered poster pinned to the inside of the train car. It had been there the entire time, but I had never noticed it before. It was a photo. A black and white photograph of a young man standing in front of the very train I was riding. The same train. The same car. But it was an image of me. A version of me I didn't recognize. It was my face, but it wasn't me, it was an older version of myself. A version that had already become one of them. I gasped, my hands gripping the seat in front of me as panic surged through my veins. The reflection, the glass, was no longer just a mirror. It was a portal, showing me a future I couldn't escape. The train continued to rattle forward, its journey never ending, and I knew then this was where I was meant to be. And this was where I would stay. Forever. I had stopped trying to make sense of it. The train car, with its silent passengers and oppressive atmosphere, had long ago ceased to be just a mode of transportation. It had become something else, something alive, something that had its own will, its own hunger. And now I knew what it wanted. Me. The figure beside me had faded into the shadows once more, but its presence was a constant weight on my shoulders, a silent accusation. The passengers, still staring, still unblinking, had not moved. They were not alive, not in any sense I understood. They were trapped, just like me. I looked around, my eyes frantic, my mind racing. I needed an escape. There had to be a way out. But no matter where I looked, the train stretched endlessly in both directions, an infinite loop of emptiness. There was no door. No windows that opened. Just the unbroken track, the constant hum of motion, the feeling of being swept away. I stood up, my legs shaking, and moved toward the aisle. The scraping noise had started again, but it wasn't behind me this time. It was ahead, coming from the front of the train. Something was drawing closer, something that was no longer content with just watching. The train had changed. It was darker now, the light flickering overhead like an old bulb struggling to stay on. The walls of the car seemed to close in, contracting around me. The scent of metal, rust, and something stale filled the air. I breathed it in, trying to steady my nerves, but I couldn't. My heart pounded so loudly I could barely hear anything else. The noise ahead was unmistakable now, clattering, like metal scraping against metal, accompanied by a low growl that seemed to vibrate the very walls of the train. I froze. It was coming for me. The thing that had been waiting, watching, it was coming. The floor beneath my feet shook, and the lights flickered one last time before plunging the train into darkness. I stumbled, my hands reaching out for anything to steady myself, but there was nothing. And then I heard it. A whisper. Don't fight it. I spun around, but there was no one there. The whisper was not from the passengers, it was from something else. Something far older. Something that had always been there, lurking in the shadows. You belong here, it continued, its voice both soothing and terrifying. You are one of us now. There is no escape. I backed away, my breath shallow, my chest tight. The scraping grew louder, closer. It was just beyond the door at the front of the car. Whatever it wasn't human. And it wasn't interested in letting me go. The train lurched again, violently this time, sending me crashing into a seat. The scraping was now joined by a thumping, like heavy footsteps. My mind screamed for me to run, to hide, but I knew it was useless. There was nowhere to go. I reached for the door handle in front of me, my fingers numb, but before I could turn it, I heard a voice from behind me, so close it felt like it was in my ear. You're not ready yet. The words were cold, final. And then I felt it. A hand. Cold fingers closed around my wrist, dragging me back toward the darkness. I twisted in its grip, but it was too strong, too unyielding. The passengers, those silent, empty eyes, stared as I was pulled away from them, as I was dragged toward the end of the car. They did nothing. They were just observers, as they had always been. I struggled, desperate, my nails scraping against the floor, but the hand wouldn't let go. It pulled me forward with a sickening certainty, each tug sending a shock of cold through my body. I looked up, just as the door at the end of the car began to open on its own. And then, I saw it. The thing on the other side of the door. It wasn't human. It wasn't even something I could fully comprehend. It was a mass of shadows and shifting forms, eyes that glowed with a sickly yellow light, and a mouth that twisted into a grotesque grin. The creature stepped forward, its presence filling the entire car. The train car, the only place that had ever seemed real to me, now felt like a cage. A scream rose in my throat, but it was swallowed by the sound of the train, the unending, grinding noise of metal against metal, the sound of something worse than death approaching. And then, just as the thing's clawed hand reached out for me, the train lurched again. The train never stops. The world spun, the lights flickered once more, and the next thing I knew, I was back at the beginning, sitting in the same seat, the same passengers staring at me with their blank, accusing eyes. But I was different now. I knew my place. The door at the front of the car closed quietly. The train never stops. It only moves forward. And I was one of them now. I blinked, but nothing changed. I hadn't moved. The passengers remained as they were, their eyes locked onto me with that same cold, unblinking stare. The train's familiar hum filled the space around me, the metallic clatter of the wheels beneath, the rhythmic pulse of motion, but there was something wrong, something fundamental had shifted. I looked around, my mind spinning. Was this it? Was this my fate now? To ride this train endlessly, with no way to escape, no chance to break free? There was no exit, no door that led to the world I once knew. No way to wake up from this nightmarish loop. No way to prove that I was real, that any of this was real. The train moved on, as it always did, but it felt different now. The air was colder, the silence heavier. The presence of the passengers, their fixed stares, felt suffocating. They were still, their bodies rigid, not moving at all, but I could feel their gaze, an unspoken judgment. They were waiting for something, something I didn't understand, something that only I could answer. I had been here before. The thought struck me like a sharp pain in my chest. I had been in this seat. I had stared at these same faces, felt the same weight in the air. But I couldn't remember when or why. I couldn't remember anything about the life I'd lived before this train. Had I ever truly existed outside of it? I glanced down at my hands, my fingers trembling as I traced the fabric of my clothes. They were ordinary, just a simple jacket, a shirt, jeans. But something about them felt alien, like I was wearing someone else's skin. My reflection was nowhere to be found. The windows remained opaque, dull, and featureless. But then, in the corner of my eye, I saw it, a flash of movement. I turned sharply, my pulse quickening, but the figure was gone. It was a fleeting shadow, no more than a trick of the light, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted, something had changed. The scraping sound returned. Only this time, it wasn't just a noise. It was a sensation, something sharp, like claws dragging across the floor. I tried to ignore it, to stay calm, but the sound grew louder, closer, as if it was coming from the space directly behind me. "Don't turn around." The whisper in my ear was soft, like a breath against my skin, but it carried an undeniable weight. It felt like a warning, one I couldn't ignore. But I had no choice. I had to look. I slowly turned my head, my stomach turning, but all I saw was the endless row of seats behind me, the unmoving passengers staring ahead, their faces blank and expressionless. Yet, in the corner of my vision, I saw it again. A face. It was pale, nearly translucent, with eyes so wide they seemed to consume everything around them. It was staring at me, not from a seat, but from the aisle, standing, watching, waiting. Its lips barely moved as it whispered, in a voice that made the air turn ice cold. "It's time." Before I could react, the scraping sound stopped. Silence filled the train once again, a deep, oppressive quiet that pressed against my eardrums. The passengers remained frozen, unmoving. The train kept speeding forward, its endless journey continuing as if nothing had happened. But I felt something. A change in the air. A shift. I wasn't just a passenger anymore. I was part of it. Part of the train. Part of the endless journey. "You will never leave." The whisper came from all around me this time, not from a single figure, but from every direction. It was in the walls, the seats, the very floor beneath me. It was in my mind. I wanted to scream, to fight back, but I couldn't. My mouth was dry, my breath shallow. My hands were clenched tight against the armrests, but it didn't matter. I couldn't move. I couldn't escape. And then I saw it, the end. The lights flickered, just as they always did, but this time they didn't go out. They grew brighter, so bright that the whole train car was flooded with light. For a moment, everything seemed clear, the faces of the passengers, their emotionless eyes staring at me, the cold and empty space that stretched infinitely in front of me. And then, there it was. A sign. It hung in the air, suspended in front of me, glowing faintly. "You are here forever." It was a simple message, yet it felt like a weight, pressing down on me, sinking deep into my bones. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. And then, as quickly as it had come, the sign vanished. The train was moving again, and I was still on it. Forever. There were no stops. There was no end. Only the endless track, stretching out before me, and the endless faces staring at me, waiting, watching, judging, silent. The train would never stop, and neither would I. It started quietly. At first, I thought it was just my mind playing tricks on me, the shadows stretching out in unfamiliar ways. I had just moved into the new apartment, and the place was cold and unfamiliar. The walls creaked, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, but nothing was out of the ordinary. Not at first. I hadn't even finished unpacking when I noticed it, the first mark. I had been sitting on the couch, staring blankly at the blank walls, when a strange sound caught my attention. It was faint, like a soft scraping against the wall, as if someone was using chalk. I stood up quickly, rushing to the kitchen to check the time. The apartment was silent, except for the usual hum of the refrigerator. But when I turned back to the living room, there it was. A small, crude drawing on the wall. A figure. A shadow of a person. It wasn't anything detailed, just a vague outline of a person with wide, empty eyes and long, spindly limbs. I chalked it up to my imagination at first. Maybe I had imagined the sound, maybe I had even made the mark myself and forgotten about it. It was late, I was tired, and I had a lot on my mind. But as the night wore on, and I settled in bed, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The next morning, I got up early to make coffee, my mind still drifting back to the strange drawing. I walked into the living room, expecting it to be gone, as if I had dreamt it all. But when I looked at the wall, I froze. Another drawing. This time, it was different. The figure had changed. The limbs were longer, more contorted. Its eyes were drawn even wider, and a jagged line of what seemed like a mouth stretched across its face. The drawing seemed alive. The longer I stared at it, the more I felt its eyes boring into me. I shook my head, trying to dispel the unease crawling up my spine. It was probably just some weird coincidence. Maybe the previous tenant had done it, and I hadn't noticed. But that didn't explain the timing, the fact that the drawing had appeared while I was asleep. Later that evening, I came home from work, tired from the long day. As I walked through the door, a strange sensation washed over me. The apartment felt colder, the air heavier. The silence seemed to press in on me, but I forced myself to shake it off. I put down my things and made my way to the living room. And there it was. Another drawing. But this one was different than the others. It wasn't just a figure anymore. There was a scene. A moment captured on the wall. It was a street, my street, the one outside my apartment building. I could tell from the small details, the cracked pavement, the familiar streetlight casting a faint shadow. And there, in the distance, was me. I froze, my heart pounding. It was unmistakable. It was me, standing under the streetlight, the same clothes I had worn that day. How could this be? I hadn't gone outside yet. I hadn't walked down the street. But the more I stared at it, the more I realized the truth. The drawing wasn't just a prediction, it was showing me something that would happen. Something that was going to happen tomorrow. And then, the door to the apartment slammed shut behind me. I spun around, heart racing, but there was no one there. No one but me. And the drawings on the walls. I tried to tell myself it was just a coincidence, just some weird fluke. But when I woke up the next morning, the figure on the wall wasn't the only strange thing I saw. The streetlight scene had faded, as if it was nothing more than chalk being wiped away by an invisible hand. But underneath it, there was something new. A series of symbols. They didn't look like any language I knew, but they were strangely familiar, as if I had seen them before in a dream. Small, jagged shapes that formed a pattern, almost like a code. It sent a shiver down my spine. The thing that scared me more than the drawings was the unsettling sense that I had no control. I didn't know who or what was drawing them. The idea that something, or someone, was waiting for me to notice these things, to make some kind of connection, gnawed at me. That morning, as I stood in front of the wall, staring at the new symbols, I heard a soft knock at the door. I wasn't expecting anyone. It was too early for the neighbors to stop by, and I hadn't ordered any food or deliveries. My heart skipped a beat, and I froze. I didn't want to open the door. The knocking came again, softer, almost as if it was trying to get my attention. Reluctantly, I moved to the door. My hand hovered over the doorknob for a moment before I opened it just a crack. There was no one there. But something was lying on the ground just outside the threshold. A small, folded piece of paper. I bent down and picked it up, my fingers trembling as I unfolded it. It was a note. No words, just a simple, intricate drawing. The same figure I had seen on the wall, the one with the wide, empty eyes. But this time, the figure had its hand outstretched, as though beckoning me forward. Suddenly, the air felt thick, like it was pressing against my skin, pushing me back. I slammed the door shut and backed away, my breath quickening. It's just a drawing, I told myself. Just a coincidence. There's a logical explanation for all of this. But even as I whispered those words, a voice inside me told me that I was lying. And that voice grew louder with each passing second, as if I were being drawn deeper into something I couldn't escape. Later that evening, I returned home after work, and the apartment was still. Too still. The silence in the air was suffocating. The last remnants of daylight were barely visible through the curtains, casting long, distorted shadows across the floor. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was waiting for me, lurking in the dark corners of the room. When I walked into the living room, I was almost expecting it. Another drawing. But this time, it wasn't a figure or a symbol. It was a scene from the day I had just lived. There I was, sitting in the small cafe down the street, sipping coffee by the window. But there was something different in the drawing. Something that wasn't right. In the drawing, I was looking directly at the wall, as if I was aware of it. As if I knew it was coming. The chill spread through me like a virus, crawling up my spine and settling in my chest. I could feel the drawing staring back at me, a mirror to reality. It wasn't just predicting the future anymore, it was rewriting it. And then, the symbols appeared beneath the scene. More of them. The jagged shapes seemed to shift and move, like they were trying to make sense of something I couldn't understand. I tried to focus on the symbols, desperate to make sense of it all. Maybe there was something hidden in them, something that could explain what was happening. But then, the apartment fell completely silent. And that was when I heard it. A soft, distant whisper, barely audible over the sound of my own breathing. It wasn't in my head. I wasn't imagining it. The whisper was coming from the wall. Tomorrow, it said. You'll see it tomorrow. I froze. The whisper echoed in my ears, repeating over and over again. My legs trembled as I backed away from the wall, heart hammering in my chest. I couldn't escape it. Tomorrow. I had to find out what was going to happen tomorrow. The whisper stayed with me all night, lingering in the darkness like a shadow that wouldn't leave. The words echoed in my mind, filling every corner of my thoughts. Tomorrow. You'll see it tomorrow. I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every gust of wind outside, seemed amplified in the silence of my apartment. I kept checking the wall, but nothing had changed since the drawing of the cafe. The same symbols were etched beneath the scene, swirling in patterns that made no sense. I couldn't tear my eyes away from them. I needed to understand. I had to understand. But as the clock ticked past midnight, a sudden fatigue overcame me. I collapsed onto the couch, my body craving rest despite the tension that gripped me. And when I closed my eyes, the drawings invaded my dreams. In my dream, I was walking down an unfamiliar street, a street that seemed to stretch endlessly in front of me. The buildings were worn and cracked, their windows dark and hollow. The air was thick, heavy with the scent of decay. I could hear the faint sound of footsteps behind me, but when I turned around, no one was there. I started running. The street twisted, and the world around me began to shift. The walls seemed to close in, the sky overhead turning a sickly shade of green. I could still hear the footsteps, faster now, chasing me. I turned a corner and found myself at the entrance of an old, abandoned building. The door was ajar, and as I stepped inside, I saw it. The wall. The same wall from my apartment. The drawings were there, but now they were moving. The figures shifted as if alive, the symbols rearranging themselves, forming new patterns. And in the center, staring back at me, was my own face. I screamed, but no sound came out. The figure on the wall, my own reflection, reached out, its hand crossing the divide between the drawing and reality. And then, it touched me. I woke with a jolt, gasping for air, my heart pounding in my chest. My skin was damp with sweat, and I could still feel the lingering presence of the figure, its cold touch burning into my flesh. The apartment was quiet, but the oppressive weight of the dream followed me. The morning light filtered through the curtains, casting long shadows across the floor. I sat up, my mind reeling from what I had just experienced. It had felt so real. It was like the dream was trying to tell me something I couldn't yet comprehend. But one thing was certain, tomorrow was no longer just a word. It was a promise. I stood up, moving toward the wall with hesitant steps. As I approached, I held my breath. I didn't want to look, but I had to. The drawings were always there, waiting for me to face them. When I reached the wall, I felt it, a heavy sense of inevitability. Something was going to happen. Something was already unfolding. And then, just as I feared, the drawings began to change. This time, it wasn't a scene from the cafe or any part of my past. It was a scene from the future. I could see myself standing in the middle of the street, my back to a dark alley. The same alley I had passed on my way home last night. But this time, there was something, or someone, lurking in the shadows. The figure was too distant, too vague to make out at first, but as I stared, its outline became clearer. It was a person, wearing a dark coat, their face obscured. I couldn't see who it was, but I felt their presence, felt the weight of their gaze on me. The drawing showed me walking closer to the alley, unknowingly heading toward that figure. The shadows seemed to grow, stretching longer and closer, as if it was waiting for me. I stepped back, my heart in my throat. The drawings, they weren't just predicting events, they were guiding them. I was being led to something I couldn't control. Tomorrow, I thought. It's all happening tomorrow. But before I could react, I felt a sudden shift in the air. The room grew colder, the temperature dropping so quickly that I could see my breath in the air. A low, almost imperceptible hum filled the space, as if the very walls of the apartment were vibrating. The drawings on the wall seemed to pulse, the figures shifting again. And then, the whisper came. Louder this time. Clearer. You're too late. I spun around, but the room was empty. The walls, the floor, the air, they were all heavy with that suffocating presence. I could feel something, someone, watching me. The question gnawed at me, what was going to happen tomorrow? And more importantly, who was guiding these drawings? I couldn't escape the suffocating weight that pressed down on me. The whisper, "You're too late," still reverberated in my mind, its meaning unclear but undeniably urgent. Something was coming. Something I could neither stop nor fully understand. The cold air in the room only deepened the sense of dread. I stood frozen, staring at the wall, as if the drawings themselves might suddenly leap off the surface and pull me into their world. But I couldn't look away, couldn't stop myself from studying them even as my heart pounded in my chest. The figure in the alley on the wall, the one I had seen in my vision, loomed closer. The outlines of the figure grew sharper, more defined, its presence drawing me in like a magnet. But the more I looked, the more the figure seemed to know I was watching. Its head tilted slightly, as if aware of my gaze. The whisper returned, this time a soft, mocking tone. "It's already begun." I stumbled back from the wall, my mind racing. The drawing wasn't just a prediction anymore. It wasn't even just a vision, it was real. Something was happening, something I couldn't outrun. I had to know what it meant. I had to understand why these drawings were appearing, why I was being pulled into them. I grabbed my jacket, suddenly aware that the air had grown colder, more oppressive. I had no choice. I couldn't wait any longer. I had to go out there. I had to find the alley, find the figure, and see this through. The streets outside were eerily quiet. The usual bustle of the city had faded into an unsettling stillness. I walked quickly, my footsteps echoing in the silence, until I reached the familiar intersection. The alley from the drawing, the one I had passed countless times before, was ahead. But this time, it was different. The shadows seemed deeper, the air heavier. I felt it in my chest, a pulse in the atmosphere, like something was waiting for me. I hesitated at the entrance, my breath catching in my throat. The alley was darker than I remembered, and I could barely see the far end. But there was a chill in the air, and the sense of something, or someone, lurking within the shadows was undeniable. The figure from the drawing was standing at the far end, its form indistinct in the gloom. It hadn't moved, but I could feel it watching me, its presence pressing against me like a weight on my chest. I stepped forward, each movement deliberate, my mind screaming at me to turn back. But I couldn't. The drawings had led me here. I had to finish this. As I approached the figure, I felt the temperature drop further, the cold biting into my skin. The figure remained motionless, its face still hidden. But as I came closer, the figure shifted, its form warping slightly, like the lines of a drawing coming to life. And then, I saw it. The face. It wasn't a face I recognized, but it was so familiar it made my stomach turn. The features were distorted, twisted, as if the face had been smudged or erased and redrawn. And then I realized. It was my face. I staggered backward, my heart racing, blood running cold. This wasn't just a vision, it wasn't a prediction. It was a mirror, showing me what I was becoming. What I had already become. The figure in the alley lifted its hand slowly, its fingers stretching toward me. I froze, unable to move, as the figure's hand hovered just inches from my own. The coldness in the air intensified, and the space between us seemed to stretch endlessly. The drawing on the wall flashed in my mind, the symbols, the jagged shapes, everything was leading to this moment. Suddenly, the figure stepped forward, and everything in the world went still. The hum I had felt before grew louder, vibrating in my bones, as if the world was on the verge of breaking apart. "It's your turn," the figure said, its voice hollow, distorted, almost like a whisper carried on the wind. I couldn't move. I couldn't speak. All I could do was watch as the figure's hand reached out, and then darkness. I don't know how long I was out. When I came to, I was back in my apartment, standing in front of the wall. The drawings were gone. The symbols had disappeared, leaving the surface of the wall eerily blank. But the silence was deafening. The room felt wrong. Everything was the same, but it wasn't. The world outside had changed somehow. I could feel it in my bones. And then I saw it. A new drawing. But this time, it wasn't on the wall. It was in the air, hovering before me, glowing faintly. A single symbol, jagged and sharp. It pulsed slowly, like a heartbeat. It was like the drawing was alive. And beneath it, the whisper returned. Tomorrow. But tomorrow didn't matter anymore. The drawings were no longer just warnings. They were my future. And no matter how far I ran, they would always be one step ahead. I couldn't breathe. The air was thick, as if it had transformed into something dense and oppressive, forcing its way into my lungs. The glowing symbol in front of me pulsed with a rhythmic, hypnotic light, drawing my gaze despite every instinct telling me to look away. The world around me felt like it was tilting, slowly unraveling. I reached out a shaking hand, my fingers brushing against the symbol, and the moment I made contact, everything froze. The room stood still. Time stopped. I felt the coldness of the wall beneath my fingers, the heaviness in the air, and the creeping dread that something was coming. Then the whisper returned. "You can't escape." I jerked my hand away, stumbling backward. The symbol disappeared the instant I pulled back, but the feeling lingered. Like the air had changed, like I had just crossed into a place I didn't belong. I turned toward the door, desperate to leave, to get out of this place. But as I reached for the handle, I saw it. The hallway outside, once familiar, had changed. The floor was covered in dust, the walls cracked, and the air smelled stale, suffocating. The apartment felt like it was sinking into itself, folding inwards, and there was no way out. My heart pounded in my chest as I ran down the hallway, but it felt like the walls were closing in with every step. The echo of my footsteps grew louder, reverberating off the walls as if the space itself was alive, waiting, watching. I reached the stairs, desperate to escape, but the steps felt wrong. They were shifting beneath my feet, as if the building itself was a living thing, bending and twisting to trap me. At the bottom of the stairs, I saw something that made my blood run cold. The hallway stretched out before me, but it was no longer my building. It was something else entirely. The walls were covered in the same jagged, glowing symbols from the drawings, twisted shapes and forms that didn't belong in this world. And at the end of the hallway, I saw her. The figure from the alley, the one whose face had mirrored my own. She stood there, her eyes hollow and dark, her hand reaching toward me, just like in the alley. "You can't outrun it," she said, her voice a low, chilling whisper. I tried to move, but my legs wouldn't obey. Fear held me in place, rooting me to the floor. The whispers grew louder, surrounding me from every direction, filling my mind with thoughts that didn't belong to me. The world around me began to shift again, like the walls were bending and twisting, creating an endless loop. The hallway stretched on forever, and no matter which way I turned, I couldn't find the exit. I ran. I ran with everything I had, but the hallway kept stretching, the walls closing in, and the symbols on the walls became more and more oppressive, suffocating me with their presence. Every time I thought I could escape, I was pulled back into the loop. I reached the stairs again. The same stairs. The same hallway. The same figure waiting at the end. The whispering grew louder. "You can't escape." I knew it was true. There was no way out. The loop had already begun, and there was nothing I could do to stop it. The drawings on the wall, the strange symbols, the figure, it was all part of something bigger, something I couldn't even comprehend. And then, as if in response to my hopelessness, the drawing appeared once more. It wasn't on the wall. It wasn't floating in front of me. It was inside my mind. I saw the symbol, glowing brightly against the darkness. And beneath it, the word tomorrow. Tomorrow was all that mattered now. But tomorrow would never come. Not in the way I wanted it to. Tomorrow would be just another repetition. Another loop. There was no escaping it. I was stuck. Trapped. And as the darkness closed in, I understood the drawings had never been a warning. They were a cycle. a never-ending, inescapable loop, and I would always be a part of it. The last thing I saw before the world went completely dark was the glowing symbol, pulsing, waiting, watching, and then nothing. Have you ever wondered if a single moment in your life could change everything? If one small decision could shatter the boundaries of time itself, leading you into something that should never have been? I used to think such things were only possible in movies or stories. But now, after what I experienced, I realize the impossible is often closer than we think. It started when I walked into that dusty old antique shop. The air inside was thick, tinged with the smell of aged paper and worn leather. I hadn't planned on staying long, just a quick stop to get out of the rain. But then something caught my eye. On a small wooden table in the far corner, almost hidden under a pile of forgotten trinkets, sat an old rotary phone. It looked out of place, its shining black surface pristine, with not a single scratch or chip to mar its appearance. The moment I saw it, something inside me clicked. I knew I had to have it, but I didn't know why. The shopkeeper, a frail old man with glasses perched at the tip of his nose, noticed my interest and shuffled over. "Ah, I see you found it," he said, his voice raspy, as though it hadn't been used much in years. "That's an unusual piece. Been in my shop for years, but no one ever takes it." I ran my fingers over the smooth plastic, feeling a strange sensation ripple through me. Something about the phone seemed wrong, as if it didn't belong here, or even now. The man smiled, almost knowingly, his eyes twinkling. "It's a special one," he added, "goes back a long time. Maybe you're the one who's meant to take it home." I could hear my heart racing, though I couldn't explain why. I didn't believe in fate or destiny. Yet, I felt compelled to buy it, compelled to take it with me. I handed the man a few bills, and he wrapped the phone carefully in brown paper, muttering something under his breath as he did. That night, the storm was worse. The wind howled outside, shaking the windows of my apartment. I sat down at my desk, unpacking the phone, marveling at how well preserved it was. I plugged it in, curious to see if it still worked. I dialed a random number, just to test it, but there was only static at first. Then, a click. A voice. It was faint, at first, like a whisper in the distance. But then it grew clearer. "Hello?" My breath caught in my throat. The voice. It was unmistakable. It was my mother. Her voice, smooth and warm, came through the receiver as if she were standing in the room with me. I had to blink a few times to make sure I wasn't imagining it. My mother had passed away 3 years ago. It couldn't be her. "Mom?" I whispered, my voice barely a breath. There was a long pause. Then she spoke again. "Is that you, son? Why do you sound so distant?" My stomach twisted. I felt the hairs on my neck rise, and a cold sweat broke out across my forehead. It couldn't be her. It was impossible. She was gone. This wasn't real. But her voice, so real, so full of warmth and concern, made it feel like she was right there with me. I swallowed hard. "Mom, how is this possible?" My voice shook, and I could barely form words. "I don't know," she replied softly. "But I can hear you, and I can talk to you. I've been waiting to tell you something." My heart raced faster. There was an unsettling calm in her voice, as if she had been expecting this moment for a long time. Something was wrong. The air around me felt charged, and my surroundings started to blur, like the phone was pulling me into another world. "What do you need to tell me?" I asked, though I feared the answer. I need you to listen carefully." Her voice grew quieter, more urgent now. "You shouldn't have taken that phone. You weren't meant to. It connects us to things that are better left untouched. Time is fragile, and you've already disrupted it." I didn't understand what she meant. My hands gripped the receiver tighter, and I could hear my breath echoing in the receiver, heavier and more frantic with each passing second. "You must put it down," she whispered, her voice trembling. "You don't know what you've done." I froze. I wanted to hang up, to turn away, but I couldn't. Something about this, something about hearing her again, pulled me deeper. The room felt colder now, the storm outside raging louder, as if the world itself was aware of what was happening. Then, a loud crackling noise erupted through the receiver, followed by a voice that wasn't hers, distorted, otherworldly, something foreign. "Put it down," the voice hissed, sounding like a warning, like a threat. Before I could react, the line went dead. I was left in silence. A thick, oppressive silence that seemed to hang in the air, waiting for something. And then, almost as soon as it had stopped, the phone rang again. But this time, I knew something was terribly wrong. I stood there, frozen, staring at the phone in my hand. The room seemed to close in around me, the air thick with an unsettling stillness. I hadn't moved. I couldn't. Something inside me told me not to answer. But I was too curious, too desperate to understand what was happening. The phone rang again, its shrill tone piercing the silence, dragging me back into reality. I took a shaky breath and, against my better judgment, lifted the receiver to my ear. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper, my throat dry and tight. There was no static this time, no distortion. Just the sound of breathing on the other end. Deep, labored breaths. I knew who it was before the voice even spoke. It was my mother again, but this time her voice was different. There was something wrong with it. It was shaky, like she was scared. But I had never heard my mother scared before. Not once in my entire life. "Son," she said, her voice trembling. "You need to listen to me. You're in danger. You don't understand. I can't help you anymore. You have to stop it before it's too late." I swallowed hard, my heart racing. "Stop what, Mom? What's going on? Why are you calling me?" "I didn't want this for you," she replied, her voice barely audible now. "I didn't want you to suffer the way I did. But it's already begun. The phone, it doesn't just call the past. It calls things that should never be disturbed." I could feel the fear rising inside me. It was a raw, suffocating feeling, a growing sense of dread that I couldn't shake. I wanted to believe it was just a hallucination, some strange trick. My mind was playing on me. But everything felt so real. The sound of her voice, the weight of her words, they had a truth to them, a weight that I couldn't ignore. "What do you mean?" I asked, barely able to keep the tremor from my voice. "I don't have much time," she said, her voice cracking. "They're coming for you. The ones who use the phone to reach into the past, they aren't human. You have to break the connection. You have to let go of the phone." A chill ran down my spine. I didn't understand. The words she was speaking didn't make sense. My mother, the woman I had loved and lost, was telling me things that felt impossible, things that my mind couldn't grasp. But before I could ask more questions, her voice faltered, as if she was struggling to stay connected. Son, I'm so sorry. I didn't want this for you, she whispered, the sound fading into a broken sob. The line went dead again. The silence that followed was deafening, as if the world itself was holding its breath. I sat there for a moment, clutching the phone, unable to move. I felt sick to my stomach, my mind reeling with what she had said. Was it really her? Or was this some twisted joke? The phone was just an object, after all, a relic of the past. But everything about it, the calls, the messages, felt far too real to ignore. I set the receiver back on the cradle, my hands trembling. But I knew it wasn't over. I could feel it in my bones. The phone had connected me to something beyond my understanding, something I wasn't ready to face. I stood up, pacing the room, trying to make sense of it all. My eyes kept darting back to the phone, which sat there innocently on the table. But I knew now that it was anything but innocent. It was a doorway, a bridge to something I couldn't control. And then, just as I thought the nightmare might end, the phone rang again. I felt my stomach drop as I reached for it, my heart racing. What if it wasn't my mother this time? What if it was something worse? The voice that had warned me earlier? I hesitated for a moment, but then I answered. Hello? A long pause. Then, the voice I feared most. This is not a game, it hissed, its tone cold and menacing. You shouldn't have answered. Now you're in it, too. We're all connected. And there's no escape. The line went dead again, and the room seemed to grow colder, darker. My breath fogged in the air, and for a split second, I thought I saw something moving out of the corner of my eye. I quickly turned, but there was nothing there. Just a phone. Waiting. Calling. I had no choice but to listen. The days that followed blurred together in a haze of confusion and dread. Every time I picked up the phone, I felt like I was crossing into something I couldn't understand. Each call from my mother felt like a warning, a desperate plea from a past that was never meant to resurface. I couldn't let go of the phone, even though I knew it was dangerous. Even though every call seemed to bring with it more questions than answers, I couldn't stop myself from answering. It was as if the voice on the other end was the only tether I had left to her. I couldn't ignore it. But the calls grew more frequent, and with each one, the voice became less and less familiar. At first, it was soft, comforting. But over time, it started to distort, twisting into something darker, more ominous. I'd sit in silence after each call, wondering if it was real, or if I was losing my mind. But it always felt too real. One night, after an especially disturbing call, I sat on the floor, my back against the wall, staring at the phone on the table. The air felt thick, like something was pressing down on me. I couldn't breathe right. The feeling of being watched, of something lurking just beyond my vision, had become unbearable. Then, just as I started to stand up, the phone rang again. The shrill tone cut through the silence, and my heart skipped a beat. I froze. My body went cold. I didn't want to answer. I couldn't bear the thought of hearing that voice again. But it was as if the phone had control over me. My hand moved of its own accord, lifting the receiver to my ear. I swallowed hard, trying to steady my breathing. Hello? My voice cracked, barely audible. This time, there was no delay. The voice on the other end was immediate, and it wasn't my mother. "It's not her anymore, is it?" the voice sneered. It was distorted, sharp, like nails on a chalkboard. But I recognized it, or at least, I thought I did. Who is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. The voice let out a low laugh, and then it spoke again. "You're in deeper than you think. You're not just talking to your mother. You're talking to all of them. And they want you to stay. Forever." I felt my stomach churn, nausea rolling over me. I didn't understand. Who was speaking to me? What did they want? I don't know what you mean," I whispered, almost pleading. "Don't play dumb. You've already made the connection," the voice hissed. "Now there's no going back. You'll never escape. Not now. Not ever." The line went dead again, and I sat there, frozen in terror. I could feel the weight of the silence pressing on me. It was as though something had shifted in the room, something dark and heavy that I couldn't shake. I dropped the receiver onto the table and stumbled back, my heart racing. I couldn't stay here. I couldn't keep living like this. The phone, whatever it was, wasn't just a relic. It was a portal to something evil, something beyond my control. I ran to the door, my mind screaming at me to leave, to get as far away from that phone as possible. But when I opened the door, I froze. Standing in the hallway outside my apartment was a shadow. A figure. A silhouette that looked too familiar. It was my mother. But it wasn't her. Her face was pale, her eyes wide and empty. There was no warmth in her gaze, only a cold, hollow emptiness. She didn't speak, but her lips moved, forming words that I couldn't hear. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. I wanted to scream, but the words wouldn't come. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of the impossible. How was she here? She was gone. She had died years ago. And yet, here she was, standing in front of me. And then, just as quickly as she had appeared, she was gone. Vanished. Like a shadow fading into the night. I stood there, shaking, trying to catch my breath. I didn't know what to do. My world was unraveling, and I was powerless to stop it. The phone rang again. My hand was shaking as I reached for it, my mind screaming at me not to answer. But I couldn't resist. I had to know. I lifted the receiver to my ear. "Hello?" My voice was barely a whisper. But this time, there was no voice. No answer. Only silence. And in that silence, I could feel something moving, something watching me. It was as if the darkness itself was closing in around me. I dropped the phone, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My body trembled, my mind spiraling into panic. The door to my apartment creaked open, and I turned, hoping for some semblance of normalcy, some escape from the madness that was consuming me. But there was no escape. The hallway was empty, just the same as it had always been. Except for one thing. The phone was still ringing. I stood frozen in place, staring at the phone. The shrill ring echoed through the apartment, filling the room with a sound that felt like a siren's call, summoning me to something terrible. My body refused to move. I knew that answering would lead me further into madness, but I couldn't stop myself. The pull was too strong. The air in the room felt thick, like the walls were closing in. Every breath I took felt shallow, as if there wasn't enough air left. The silence between each ring was oppressive, hanging heavy like a storm about to break. I didn't know how much longer I could stand it. The phone stopped ringing for a moment, but the silence that followed was worse than the sound of the bell. I glanced around, my eyes darting toward the open door. No sign of anyone, no mother, no shadow. Yet the feeling that something was there, watching me, lingered. Then, the phone rang again. I flinched at the sound, each ring slicing through the air like a sharp blade. I wanted to run, to leave everything behind and escape this nightmare. But I couldn't. My hand moved to the receiver without my consent, and I lifted it to my ear. Hello? My voice was barely audible, shaky, as though I was speaking underwater. For a long moment, there was nothing. Not a sound, not a breath. Just the oppressive weight of the silence, pressing on me from all sides. Then, a voice. Soft, almost imperceptible at first. But I recognized it instantly. Son, is that you? My mother's voice. Or at least, it sounded like her. But there was something wrong. The warmth, the comfort I once felt from her voice was gone. There was an eerie chill to her words, as if they were coming from somewhere far away. Mom? My voice cracked. My heart was pounding in my chest. How is this? How are you? I'm here, but not for long, she interrupted, her voice growing faint. I'm stuck, in between. The words hit me like a punch to the gut. I felt my knees weaken as a cold sweat broke out across my skin. Stuck? What do you mean? Where are you? I could hear her breathing now, labored and uneven, like she was struggling to speak. It sent a shiver down my spine. Not where, when, she whispered. I've been waiting for you. All this time. You have to listen, you have to understand. What is it? I asked, my voice trembling, desperate. What do you want from me? She let out a breath that sounded more like a sigh, and then her voice turned to something almost like a plea. Don't answer the phone again. The others are listening. They know. They can hear everything. Before I could ask what she meant, the line went dead. The phone clicked sharply in my ear, cutting off her voice. The silence that followed was suffocating. I dropped the receiver onto the table and stumbled back, my mind racing. What was happening? Was she really there? Was I losing my mind? I ran my hands through my hair, trying to ground myself, to make sense of everything. But nothing made sense anymore. The phone, the calls, nothing was real. And yet, it all felt so real, so close. I couldn't stay here. I had to leave. But where could I go? What was left? I grabbed my coat, throwing it over my shoulders, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the buttons. The door was still open, the hallway still empty. But I could feel it. The pull. The darkness that had been creeping closer with each passing moment. As I stepped out into the hall, I looked over my shoulder, half expecting to see her again, my mother, or whatever it was that had been speaking to me. But the hallway was empty. The building was silent. I turned to leave, but something caught my eye. The phone. Still sitting on the table in my apartment, the receiver now off the hook, dangling loosely. I could have sworn I heard it. A faint click. A low the kind of noise you hear just before something bad happens. I couldn't ignore it. It was calling me, pulling me back. My feet moved on their own, leading me toward it. I hesitated for a second, my hand hovering over the door, but the urge to go back was overwhelming. I opened the door, stepped inside, and walked toward the phone. The room felt colder now. The shadows in the corners seemed to stretch longer, and the air felt thicker. I reached out, almost without thinking, and grabbed the receiver again. "Hello?" My voice was shaky, unsure. This time, there was no delay. "This is your final warning," the voice said, distorted and crackling. It wasn't my mother. Not anymore. You've already made the choice. There's no escaping now. The words chilled me to my core. I wanted to hang up, but I couldn't. Something about the voice, it wasn't just talking to me. It was controlling me. "You are ours now. Forever." The line went dead once more, but the words echoed in my mind. I slammed the receiver back onto the phone, my chest heaving as I stumbled back, panicking. I had to leave. I had to get away from this. From the phone, from whatever was happening. But when I looked up, the shadows had changed. They weren't just shadows anymore. They were figures, dark, indistinct shapes that seemed to move, shifting in the corners of the room. I could feel their presence closing in, surrounding me. The room seemed to shrink as the darkness grew. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take it anymore, I heard a knock on the door. The knock on the door was soft at first, a gentle tap against the wood. But it wasn't the sound of a visitor, it was the sound of a warning. Each tap seemed to echo deeper in my mind, reverberating in the hollow spaces where fear festered. I stood frozen, paralyzed by the horror of what I knew was coming, what was already here. The room was darker now. The shadows had thickened, taking on shapes and forms that weren't there before. They seemed to move on their own, writhing and stretching in the corners, waiting for something or someone. Another knock. This one louder, more insistent. I turned slowly, my eyes flicking to the door. My heart hammered in my chest as I realized I was not alone. It wasn't just the phone anymore, it was everything. The walls, the air, the very space around me seemed to be alive, aware of my presence. I stumbled toward the door, my hands trembling as I reached for the handle. I couldn't stop myself. Some force, some invisible hand, was pushing me forward, drawing me closer to whatever waited on the other side. I opened the door. Empty. Just the dim light of the hallway spilling into the room, nothing more. No one stood there. No figure in the dark. Just silence. The sound of my own breath, ragged and quick, filled the space. I stepped back, relief flooding through me for a moment. But as I turned to shut the door, I saw something on the floor, a slip of paper, creased and old. It was barely visible, as though it had been placed there intentionally, just outside my reach. My fingers brushed it, picking it up with unease. The paper was smooth, cool to the touch, and as I unfolded it, a chill ran down my spine. The message was short, scrawled in a hurried, trembling hand. "You shouldn't have answered." The words burned in my mind, the ink seeming to smear into my vision. I knew what it meant. I knew that everything was coming to a head, that this was the end. There was no going back. The phone wasn't just a device, it was a connection, a tether to something beyond, something ancient and unforgiving. I dropped the paper, my mind racing, my heart pounding so loud it felt like it would burst. The shadows in the room seemed to breathe with me, expanding and contracting as though they were aware of my every move. And then it rang again. The phone. I didn't need to look at it to know. I could feel it calling to me, the same voice from before, distorted and cold, pulling me closer. This time, I didn't hesitate. I didn't try to fight it. I reached out, lifted the receiver to my ear, and listened. Hello? My voice was barely a whisper, lost in the stillness. A pause. Then, my mother's voice, softer than ever, filled the space around me. But this time, it wasn't comforting. It wasn't familiar. It was an echo, a hollow version of her. I told you not to answer, she said, her words slow, deliberate. But now it's too late. You've crossed over. And there's no going back. The shadows in the room seemed to shift again, their forms becoming clearer, more distinct. They were figures now, tall, dark, and looming, moving toward me. I could hear them whispering in a language I didn't understand, their voices overlapping and chaotic. Mom, no, I whispered, the words trembling in my throat. Please, please tell me what's happening. She didn't answer immediately. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. The shadows moved closer, their presence suffocating, each step heavier than the last. Don't listen to them, my mother's voice came again, but it was different now, desperate, pleading. They're not real. Don't let them take you. I wanted to scream, to throw the phone down, to run, to do anything to escape. But I was paralyzed. My body wouldn't obey me. The figures were closing in on me, their forms becoming clearer with each passing second. They were tall, gaunt, their features indistinct but threatening. Their eyes, if you could call them eyes, glowed faintly in the dark. I'm sorry, my mother's voice cracked, the sound barely audible. You should have never answered. The words were final. The moment stretched into a void, a dark abyss where time no longer mattered. The figures around me loomed, their presence growing overwhelming. And as I stood there, holding the phone to my ear, I realized the truth. I had been waiting for this moment my entire life. I had been waiting for the call. And now, it had come. The shadows were here to claim me. But then, a loud crash broke through the silence, the sound like glass shattering, filling the air with a sharp, terrifying noise. The phone went dead in my hand. I dropped it, my heart racing. The shadows paused, still for just a moment, as if they were listening. And then, they surged forward, their forms too quick, too dark, too close. But just as they reached me, everything went black. Hope your dreams are filled with fear. Good night.